A city once crowned with songs now lies in silence, its streets choked with ashes and unanswered prayers. How did the people chosen by God fall so far, and could hope possibly rise again from such ruin? The smoke of Samaria's ruins still lingered in memory when Judah looked north and trembled. The Assyrian war machine had swept through the land of their brothers like fire through dry grass, tearing down fortresses, carrying away kings, and scattering 10 tribes into exile from which they would never return. In Jerusalem, people whispered of the empty towns that once rang with laughter, now nothing but fields for wild beasts. The northern kingdom was gone, a warning carved into history. Judah survived, but survival carried its own weight. The little kingdom clung to the hills of Jerusalem and the villages surrounding it, a fragile remnant in a world of giants. To the west loomed Egypt, ancient yet still ambitious. To the north and east, Assyria's power remained strong, though cracks were beginning to show in its vast empire. Behind those cracks, a new name was rising: Babylon, a storm on the horizon not yet understood but destined to shape Judah's fate. Inside Jerusalem's walls, the people lived with both pride and fear. Pride, because the temple still stood, gleaming with gold, the visible reminder that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had chosen Zion as his dwelling place. Fear, because armies moved like shadows across the world, and Judah was a pawn on their board. The memory of God's deliverance in days past, the angel that struck down Assyrian soldiers in the night when Hezekiah prayed, still gave them comfort, but also bred complacency. Surely, they thought, the Lord would never allow his city to fall, no matter how far they drifted from his covenant. Yet drift they did. In the markets, idols appeared alongside grain and spices. Families whispered prayers not only to the God of Israel but also to the gods of Canaan, Egypt, and the stars above. Kings rose and fell, some faithful, others corrupt, and the people followed whichever way the wind blew. Prophets spoke, crying out against injustice and idolatry, warning that covenant blessings would not protect a nation that abandoned its God. But their voices were often mocked or silenced. The priests kept the temple services running, sacrifices burned daily, incense rose heavenward, but beneath the smoke, corruption spread. The poor groaned under heavy burdens while the wealthy built larger houses from their labor. Judges took bribes. Prophets for hire told kings what they wanted to hear, and truth was drowned out by comfort. The covenant, once a living relationship, was treated like a charm, a guarantee of safety rather than a call to holiness. It was in this fragile state that Judah entered its final century, a nation outwardly secure but inwardly rotting, surrounded by powers it could not control, unwilling to confront the sins corroding its soul. The fall of the north was a warning, but warnings only matter if they are heeded. Judah stood at the edge of the same abyss, balancing between faithfulness and ruin, clinging to a fragile illusion that the city of God could never fall. But history was already moving, and the storm was coming. The throne of Judah had seen corruption and weakness, but in Josiah a different spirit stirred. He was only a boy of 8 when the crown was set upon his head, a child king inheriting a kingdom fractured by idolatry and fear. Few expected much from him, yet as he grew, something burned within him that did not come from advisors or politics but from a deeper place, a longing for the God of his fathers. By the time he was 16, while other kings were still chasing pleasure and power, Josiah began to seek the Lord with a seriousness rare in his age. The altars of Baal, once tolerated, soon felt his wrath. Groves where idols had been adored fell beneath his command, smashed to rubble, ashes scattered on the wind. What drove him was not ambition but conviction. He saw the ruins of the north, the silent fields where Israel's tribes had vanished, and he understood the reason. They had abandoned their God. Determined not to let Judah follow the same path, Josiah began cleansing the land with a zeal that startled even his allies. He tore down high places that had stood for generations. He defiled shrines where fire once burned to Molech. He left no trace of the false worship that had spread like rot through the nation. His actions were not merely political, they were spiritual war. One king standing against centuries of compromise. When he was 26, Josiah turned his attention to the house of the Lord itself. The temple, meant to be a place of glory, had fallen into neglect. Cracked stones, broken beams, and worn walls bore witness to years of abandonment. He ordered its repair, sending priests and workers to gather funds and restore what had been dishonored. It was during this labor that a discovery shook the kingdom. Buried in the dust of neglect lay a scroll, the Book of the Law, forgotten for generations. When it was read aloud before the king, Josiah's heart shattered. The words of covenant, the blessings for obedience and curses for rebellion, struck him with unbearable weight. He tore his garments, weeping, for he knew Judah's guilt was great and judgment already near. But Josiah did not sink into despair. He acted. He gathered the elders, the priests, the people, and he read the words of the law to them, binding the nation anew to their God. He led in covenant renewal, calling the people to follow the Lord with all their heart and soul. Passover was celebrated as it had not been for centuries, with joy and reverence filling Jerusalem. For a moment, it was as if the nation had turned back time, returning to purity and faithfulness. Yet shadows lingered. Though Josiah's zeal burned bright, the people's hearts were not all changed. Some bowed outwardly but clung inwardly to their idols. Still, in the story of Judah's decline, Josiah stood as a brief, blazing light, a reformer king whose devotion delayed judgment and reminded the nation of what true faithfulness looked like. His reign was a pause, a mercy before the storm. The temple repairs had begun as a practical effort, a king determined to restore dignity to the house of the Lord. Stones were set straight, beams replaced, gold polished until it caught the sunlight like fire. Priests and Levites bustled about, their hands dusty from years of neglect. Amid the noise of hammers and the scent of fresh-cut cedar, something unexpected happened. A priest named Hilkiah, searching through storerooms long forgotten, uncovered a scroll. Its leather was cracked with age, its writing faded yet still legible. This was no ordinary record or royal decree. It was the book of the law, the Torah itself, hidden, abandoned, or perhaps preserved by unseen providence until this very moment. When Hilkiah brought the scroll to Shaphan the scribe, the weight of it was immediately felt. They carried it to the king, not with casual hands, but with the trembling sense that they held destiny itself. Shaphan read from the scroll before Josiah, his voice steady, the words ancient yet piercingly alive. Blessings for obedience rang with hope, but curses for disobedience fell like thunder. Every syllable seemed written not for ancestors long gone, but for Judah as it stood in that very hour. Josiah's face changed as he listened, his jaw tightening, his eyes darkening with grief. When the reading ended, silence filled the chamber, broken only by the sound of fabric tearing as the king ripped his garments in anguish. He understood what many ignored. Judah was guilty. The idols in the land, the blood of innocents, the injustice in the courts, all stood condemned by the very covenant that defined them as a people. The words of Moses were not ancient history. They were judgment written in fire, waiting to fall. Josiah felt the weight not just as king but as man, as son of David responsible for a nation's soul. He did not hide his despair. Instead, he sent for the prophetess Huldah, asking her to seek the Lord. Her reply confirmed what Josiah feared. Judgment was coming. Jerusalem's sins had piled too high, her rebellion too deep, for wrath to be turned aside forever. Yet mercy glimmered in her words. Because Josiah's heart was tender, because he humbled himself and wept before the Lord, the disaster would not come in his days. He would see peace, though the storm brewed beyond his lifetime. This rediscovery was more than the return of a forgotten scroll. It was revelation. For years, Judah had lived in ignorance, worshipping in the temple without knowing the full measure of God's commands. Now the word stood before them like a mirror, exposing truth and demanding response. Josiah did not treat them as relic, but as living covenant. He gathered the people, great and small, and had the book read aloud so that all might hear. On that day, Jerusalem trembled under the weight of rediscovered truth, a nation reminded that its fate rested not in armies or alliances but in obedience to the God whose words had never faded, even when hidden in dust. The day of covenant renewal dawned with a gravity Jerusalem had not felt in generations. Word spread quickly that King Josiah was gathering the people. Not for war, not for tribute, but for something far older and more sacred. From the villages and hillsides, from the markets and fields, men, women, and children streamed toward the city, filling its streets until there was scarcely room to stand. At the center of it all stood the temple, now cleansed of idols, its courts waiting to echo with a promise long neglected. Josiah, the king who had torn down altars and smashed idols, now stood not as conqueror but as servant of the covenant. Before him lay the scroll that had been found in the dust of the temple. The priests held it reverently, and when the reading began, a silence deeper than battlefields or marketplaces settled over the crowd. The words of Moses rose once more in Jerusalem, the commands of God ringing with clarity, the blessings for obedience shining like hope, the curses for rebellion chilling the air with their inevitability. The people listened, many for the first time, as their history and their destiny were read aloud. Josiah did not remain apart. He did not stand above the people as though he were immune. He stood with them, his garments torn, his head bowed, his face streaked with tears. When the reading ended, he lifted his voice not as ruler commanding subjects, but as a man pleading with his nation. He declared that he would walk after the Lord, keep his commandments, and seek his face with all his heart and soul. Then he invited no, compelled the people to do the same. The response was not mere ritual. Something stirred in the crowd, a mingling of shame and hope, of grief and longing. The sins of fathers and kings weighed heavy, but the possibility of renewal glimmered before them. Together, with one voice and one heart, they swore to return to the covenant, to cast away idols, to serve the Lord who had chosen them. It was not perfection that was promised, but devotion, not flawless obedience, but a turning back from rebellion to faithfulness. In the days that followed, Josiah ensured that this vow was not empty. He reinstituted the Passover with a grandeur and reverence not seen since the days of the judges. Lambs were slain, blood sprinkled, unleavened bread baked, and eaten in remembrance of the God who had brought them out of Egypt. Songs of deliverance filled the temple courts, echoing into the night. For once, the nation remembered not just who they were, but whose they were. Yet, beneath the joy of renewal lingered a sobering truth. The prophetess had spoken, and Josiah knew judgment still waited beyond his lifetime. The covenant had been restored, but the scars of generations could not be erased in a single day. Still, for that moment, Jerusalem stood united in faith, the people and their king bound together under the word of their God, a fragile light flickering before the darkness that was already on its way. The reforming king who had torn down idols and renewed the covenant would meet his end not in triumph, but on a battlefield far from Jerusalem. The shadow of empires pressed in on Judah, Egypt stirring in the south, Babylon rising in the east, Assyria tottering in the north. In the year when Pharaoh Necho marched to aid the fading Assyrian power, his armies moved through the Jezreel Valley, aiming for the plains of Megiddo. Josiah, though warned by the Pharaoh not to interfere, chose to confront him. Perhaps he believed covenant faithfulness demanded resistance to foreign powers. Perhaps he thought the Lord who had preserved Judah in the days of Hezekiah would defend again. Whatever the reason, Josiah went out to battle. The clash came swiftly. Egypt's chariots thundered across the plain, wheels slicing the earth, horses breathing fire. Judah's army, brave but small, met them with shields lifted and spears set. Among them, their king rode, young yet resolute, his eyes fixed on the horizon as though he could command the outcome by sheer devotion. But destiny was not in his hands. In the chaos of battle, an arrow found its mark. Josiah fell, struck down, his blood soaking the soil of Megiddo. The soldiers around him panicked, lifting his wounded body from the field, rushing him back toward Jerusalem. But the wound was mortal. The reformer king, the last great hope of Judah, died before reaching home. News spread like wildfire through the city. The wails of grief echoed through every street, rising from palace and marketplace alike. Jeremiah, the prophet who had warned and wept through Josiah's reign, lifted a lament that pierced the nation's heart. He mourned not only the king but what the king's death meant. With Josiah gone, the thin barrier between Judah and ruin had crumbled. The covenant had been renewed, but the people's hearts were still divided, and now the shepherd who led them into faithfulness was no more. The funeral was unlike any in Judah's history. Men beat their chests, women tore their garments, priests wept openly in the temple courts. Songs of mourning filled the air. Jeremiah's dirge taken up by countless voices. Fallen, fallen is the one who sought to turn us back to God. The tears were not only for Josiah but for themselves, for what they knew must follow. Pharaoh Necho had not been stopped. Babylon loomed on the horizon. Without Josiah's courage and devotion, Judah was left vulnerable, a small kingdom caught between crushing powers. In the silence that followed his burial, despair settled like dust over Jerusalem. The people remembered the Passover he had restored, the idols he had destroyed, the covenant he had renewed. They remembered his zeal, his tears, his hope, but memory could not protect them from what was coming. Josiah's reign had been a bright flame, burning against the darkness, but at Megiddo the flame was extinguished, and the night began to fall. The people of Judah, still stunned by Josiah's death, moved quickly to place his son on the throne. Jehoahaz, also called Shallum, was only 23, but he carried the hopes of a grieving nation. The people chose him over his older brother, perhaps sensing a spirit more like Josiah's, perhaps simply desperate for a leader who might continue the path of reform. His coronation was rushed, more necessity than celebration, for Egypt's armies still prowled the land, and the balance of power was shifting with terrifying speed. For 3 months he reigned, and in those short weeks Judah caught a glimpse of what might have been. He opposed the heavy hand of Egypt, refusing to bow meekly to Pharaoh's will. Some saw in him his father's courage, a defiance that stirred pride in the weary citizens of Jerusalem. Yet the same defiance that inspired his people drew the wrath of Pharaoh Necho. The Egyptian ruler had not forgotten Josiah's interference at Megiddo, and he had no intention of tolerating resistance from Josiah's son. The summons came swiftly. Jehoahaz was seized at Riblah in Syria, bound in chains, and carried away toward Egypt. He had barely begun his rule when it was cut short, his throne snatched from beneath him by foreign hands. No glorious battle ended his reign. No act of betrayal within Jerusalem's walls, just the cold reality that Judah no longer determined its own fate. The days of independence were gone. In Jerusalem, grief turned to humiliation. The people had chosen their king, but their choice meant nothing to Pharaoh. Jehoahaz's brief reign became a symbol of their powerlessness, a reminder that they were pawns in a game played by empires far greater than themselves. They watched as Pharaoh imposed heavy tribute on the land, demanding silver and gold to fill Egyptian coffers. Fields once harvested for families were now emptied to pay foreign masters. Homes that had escaped destruction now surrendered their wealth under crushing tax. For Jehoahaz himself, exile was his fate. He would never see Jerusalem again. Carried away into Egypt, He became a living ghost of Judah's lost freedom, a prince-king reduced to captive, a memory that haunted the people even as another brother. Eliakim, renamed Jehoiakim by Pharaoh, was placed on the throne as a puppet ruler. The reign of Jehoahaz lasted only 3 months, a season too brief to change Judah's destiny but long enough to reveal the fragility of their hope. He stood between Josiah's faithful light and the gathering storm of Babylon. A flicker of resistance extinguished almost before it began. In his downfall, Judah began to taste the bitter truth. The kingdom was no longer its own master, and the chains of exile were already tightening. Judah had buried its last faithful king, and with him, much of its freedom. Pharaoh Necho of Egypt, having slain Josiah at Megiddo and dragged Jehoahaz away in chains, now held Judah in his grasp. Jerusalem no longer moved by its own will but at the command of a foreign throne. The once proud kingdom of David and Solomon was reduced to a vassal state, forced to bow to Egypt's demands or face swift destruction. The humiliation came swiftly and openly. Pharaoh installed Eliakim, Josiah's elder son, upon the throne but stripped him of his name, as if to remind all of Judah that their king's identity belonged to Egypt. Eliakim was renamed Jehoiakim, a title not of honor but of servitude, stamped by Pharaoh's will. The gesture stung more than words could express, for in the ancient world a name carried one's destiny, and now Judah's destiny was chained to Egypt's chariot wheels. The tribute imposed was crushing. Pharaoh demanded silver and gold, and the burden fell not upon the palace alone but upon every household. Families who had once lived modestly now found their grain, livestock, and heirlooms stripped away to satisfy a master in Memphis. Markets grew empty, laughter faded from the streets, and bitterness seeped into daily life. The temple, once a place of hope, now seemed a hollow shell, for its people were enslaved not in body but in spirit, bound by obligations they could not escape. Jehoiakim, seated on the throne by Pharaoh's decree, quickly showed himself unequal to the task of shepherding a wounded nation. Where his father Josiah had walked in humility and devotion, Jehoiakim walked in pride and cruelty. He taxed the people heavily to meet Egypt's demands and built palaces with forced labor while the poor starved. His reign brought not renewal but corruption, his loyalty not to the covenant but to the master who had crowned him. The people groaned under his rule, yet they feared Egypt more than they hated their king. Jeremiah, the prophet, lifted his voice in those days with warnings sharper than sword and spear. He reminded Judah that reliance on Egypt was a false hope, that their true strength lay in obedience to the Lord, not in paying tribute to Pharaoh. But his words fell on ears too weary, too afraid, too compromised. The memory of Josiah's faithfulness only deepened the sense of loss, for the contrast between father and son was painful to behold. Thus, Judah lived in chains, not of iron but of dependence. Egypt's shadow stretched over Jerusalem's walls, a constant reminder that the kingdom's fate no longer lay in its own hands. Yet even as Pharaoh tightened his grip, another empire was rising beyond the horizon, stronger and more relentless than Egypt. Babylon's armies were gathering, and soon Judah would learn that the chains of Pharaoh were only the beginning. The path to exile had begun, and there was no turning back. Jehoiakim sat on the throne of David, but everyone knew it was Pharaoh's hand that had placed him there. His crown was not a symbol of sovereignty but a badge of servitude, and the people felt the weight of that shame in their daily lives. Pharaoh Necho demanded tribute, and Jehoiakim squeezed it from his subjects without mercy. Grain once stored for families was carted away in wagons bound for Egypt. Silver was torn from homes where it had been cherished for generations. Judah was bled to keep Egypt satisfied, and Jehoiakim enforced it with the cold efficiency of a man more concerned with pleasing his overlord than protecting his people. He did not inherit his father's humility or zeal for God. Where Josiah had walked in covenant faithfulness, Jehoiakim walked in arrogance. He built for himself palaces of cedar while his people groaned beneath their burdens, a king of vanity in a land growing weaker by the day. He showed no regard for the prophet's voice, no interest in the law that once had broken his father's heart. Jeremiah stood often in the temple courts, warning of judgment, pleading for repentance. But Jehoiakim dismissed him as a nuisance. The king's pride blinded him to the truth that Judah's days were numbered, and his rule was nothing more than a pawn's move on a board controlled by greater powers. The politics of the age shifted quickly. Babylon rose like a storm in the east, swallowing Assyria, pressing against Egypt, claiming victory after victory. When Nebuchadnezzar struck Egypt at Carchemish, the world changed overnight. Egypt's power waned, and Babylon's shadow fell across Judah. Jehoiakim, ever the opportunist, shifted his allegiance with the wind. He bent his knee to Babylon, sending tribute to Nebuchadnezzar as once he had to Pharaoh, proving that his loyalty was never to his people or his God, but only to whichever empire loomed strongest at the moment. But even submission could not shield him. The tribute demanded by Babylon was no lighter than Egypt's, and the people grew weary of feeding foreign treasuries while their own land languished. Jehoiakim's cruelty only deepened their misery. He silenced dissent with blood, disregarded justice, and surrounded himself with flatterers who told him only what he wished to hear. His reign became a bitter taste in the nation's mouth, a season of corruption and fear in which hope flickered but could not find flame. Jeremiah's words pierced the gloom, declaring that Jehoiakim's palace would not preserve him, that he would die unlamented, dragged out like refuse beyond the gates of Jerusalem. The prophet's warnings rang harsh, but they revealed the truth. Jehoiakim's throne was fragile, his kingdom crumbling beneath the weight of sin and servitude. Thus Judah lived through years of emptiness, under a king who wore the crown but bore no honor. The people knew the walls of Jerusalem still stood, the temple still gleamed, but the heart of the nation was hollow. Jehoiakim reigned, but he did not rule. Judah's destiny was being written elsewhere in Babylon's courts, in the decrees of kings who neither knew nor feared the God of Israel. The voice of Jeremiah first rose in Judah during the days of Josiah, but it was in the reign of Jehoiakim that his words cut deepest, for the prophet spoke against a kingdom already sliding toward ruin. He was young when the Lord first touched his lips with fire, reluctant to stand before kings, fearful of the weight placed upon him. Yet once the call came, he could not silence it. "I am only a child," he had said, but the Lord had answered, "Do not say you are a child. You will go where I send you, and you will speak what I command." From that moment, Jeremiah carried a burden heavier than stone, the burden of truth in a nation that did not want to hear it. He walked through Jerusalem's markets, past priests chanting in the temple, past merchants crying their wares, and he saw what others refused to see. The people brought offerings, but their hearts bowed to idols. They recited prayers, but their hands shed innocent blood. In the courts, judges twisted justice for bribes. In the palace, Jehoiakim built cedar-lined halls while his people starved. Jeremiah's eyes burned with grief as he cried out, "Do not trust in deceptive words, saying, 'This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord.' Will you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, and then come and stand before me in this house?" His voice echoed off the stones, accusing not just the king but the nation itself. The people despised him for it. They preferred prophets who spoke of peace, men who promised that Egypt's help or Babylon's tribute would secure their safety. Jeremiah's warnings of coming judgment sounded like treason, his words too harsh for ears dulled by comfort and compromise. He was mocked, ridiculed, thrown into stocks, yet still he spoke. His tears became as famous as his prophecies, for he did not thunder with joy at the thought of judgment, but wept like a father watching a child race toward fire. Often he stood alone. Even the priests despised his message, for he declared that the temple itself could not save a corrupt nation. He reminded them of Shiloh, once the dwelling place of the tabernacle, now a ruin. Go there, he urged, and see what disobedience brings. Do you think this house will stand if you treat it as a charm while despising the covenant it represents? The words stung, but the people hardened their hearts. In the quiet of night, Jeremiah lamented his calling. He longed for silence, for peace. Yet the word of the Lord burned in his bones, demanding to be spoken. He cried not only against kings and priests but for the soul of Judah itself. A nation still pretending it was safe because walls stood and sacrifices burned. His early warnings carried the ache of inevitability. Unless Judah turned back, the city would fall, the temple would burn, and the people would weep in exile. Few believed him. Fewer still listened. But Jeremiah's voice would not be silenced, for it carried heaven's grief over a people rushing toward their own destruction. Winter's chill pressed against Jerusalem when Jeremiah's words reached the palace. The prophet had dictated his warnings to Baruch the scribe, line after line poured out on parchment, words of fire carried by ink. The scroll held years of prophecy, judgment against kings and priests, against the people and the city itself. It was not merely a record. It was the beating heart of God's grief laid bare for a stubborn nation. When the scroll was read aloud in the temple courts, whispers spread quickly, and soon the words found their way into the ears of Jehoiakim. The king sat in his winter house, a fire burning bright in the brazier before him. Courtiers stood nearby, uneasy as the scroll was unrolled and read. Line after line condemned his reign, his arrogance, his injustice. Jeremiah's voice carried through Baruch's writing, pronouncing Babylon's coming as the rod of God's anger, declaring that the city would burn if repentance did not come. Every sentence struck like a hammer against stone, and Jehoiakim's face hardened with each word. Then, with a gesture that stunned the room, he seized a knife. As the scribe read column by column, the king cut the parchment, tossing each fragment into the flames. The fire devoured the words, curling the edges, turning prophecy into ash. His court watched in silence, fear and disbelief mingling in their eyes, but none dared stop him. Piece by piece, Jeremiah's warnings vanished into smoke, as though the king believed he could erase truth itself by destroying its record. The act was more than defiance. It was desecration. In burning the scroll, Jehoiakim declared war not on Jeremiah but on the God who had spoken through him. He would not bow to warnings, would not humble himself as his father Josiah had done when the book of the law was read. Josiah had torn his garments in repentance. Jehoiakim tore God's words in contempt. Yet the word of the Lord is not so easily silenced. When Baruch, shaken but resolute, reported to Jeremiah what the king had done, the prophet did not despair. Instead, he dictated again, every oracle, every judgment, and more besides. A new scroll was written, heavier with warnings than the first. What the king had sought to burn was now multiplied, indestructible truth written once more. Jehoiakim had thought himself master of fire, but in truth he had only kindled greater flames against himself. The ashes of the scroll did not erase judgment, they foretold it. The fire in the brazier was nothing compared to the fire that would one day consume his city. While the winter winds carried away the smoke of burned parchment, heaven recorded his defiance, and the prophet's voice grew stronger. The scrolls burned, but the word endured, unquenched, indestructible, waiting to be fulfilled. The dust of empires swirled across the ancient world, and Judah, small and vulnerable, found itself trapped in the struggle of giants. Egypt, old as the Nile itself, still reached northward with ambitions of empire, unwilling to release its claim to the lands that once fed its power. Babylon, fierce and rising, pressed from the east with armies that moved like storms, devouring city after city. Between them lay Judah, a sliver of land perched on the ridge between desert and sea, a crossroads coveted by kings, yet too weak to resist either power. At first, Egypt held sway. Pharaoh Necho had humbled Judah at Megiddo, carried Jehoahaz away in chains, and installed Jehoiakim as his puppet. Tribute flowed southward, draining the people's strength. The humiliation was bitter, but for a time it seemed stable. Judah adjusted to life under Egypt's shadow, its king obeying Pharaoh's will, its people paying Pharaoh's price, but the ground beneath them was shifting. Babylon rose like fire on the horizon, led by Nebuchadnezzar, a commander with the ambition of a conqueror and the ruthlessness of a predator. The decisive blow came at Carchemish. There, on the banks of the Euphrates, Babylon crushed Egypt's might, shattering its armies, scattering its pride. The news raced through the region like lightning. Egypt was broken, and Babylon was master of the world. For Judah, the change was immediate and devastating. Yesterday, they were Pharaoh's vassal. Today, they belonged to Nebuchadnezzar. No treaties had been signed. No armies marched through Jerusalem's gates. But the reality was clear. Judah's allegiance was no longer a choice, it was survival. Jehoiakim bent quickly, swearing loyalty to Babylon, sending tribute eastward as once he had sent it to Egypt. The king's throne remained, but it stood on foundations of fear. In the markets, the people whispered, would Egypt recover and return? Would Babylon's wrath fall if Judah faltered in obedience? Every caravan that entered the city seemed to carry not just goods but rumors, armies gathering on the Nile, Babylonian legions on the march, alliances shifting like sand. Caught between two powers, Judah's identity began to fracture. Some argued for trust in Egypt, hoping the old empire might rise again. Others counseled surrender to Babylon, seeing in its victories the hand of destiny. Few looked to the covenant, to the God who had once struck down Assyrians at Jerusalem's gates. The people's hope shifted between foreign thrones, their faith scattered like dust in the wind. Jeremiah's voice rose in this tension, calling Judah to stop trusting in Egypt's promises or Babylon's terror, warning that both were instruments in the Lord's hand. But his cries fell on ears too consumed with politics and fear. Judah stood on a knife's edge, its fate no longer its own. The clash of Egypt and Babylon was not a distant thunderstorm. It was a storm that had already broken, and Judah was caught in the flood. The world had seen empires before, but Babylon's rise under Nebuchadnezzar felt different, like a fire no water could quench. The old powers trembled Assyria. Long the terror of nations had fallen, its cities reduced to rubble. Egypt, proud of its ancient glory, reeled from defeat at Carchemish. Out of the ruins stepped Nebuchadnezzar, son of Nabopolassar, heir to a new vision of empire. His armies moved with precision, their banners bright against the desert sky, their siege engines grinding down every stronghold that dared resist. City after city fell, until Babylon stood unrivaled, a lion among nations. Nebuchadnezzar was not merely a warrior, he was ambitious, cunning, and relentless. His conquests stretched from the rivers of Mesopotamia to the mountains of Syria, from the Fertile Crescent to the very borders of Egypt. He demanded loyalty with tribute and submission, and where it faltered, he unleashed destruction swift and merciless. Word of his victories spread faster than his armies, carried by terrified refugees who whispered of walls breached, temples burned, and kings bound in chains. The name of Nebuchadnezzar became synonymous with inevitability. Resistance seemed as futile as standing against the tide. Judah, small and fragile, could not escape his gaze. Situated at the crossroads of trade and conquest, it lay directly in the path of Babylon's ambitions. Jehoiakim, once a servant of Pharaoh, now bowed to Nebuchadnezzar, sending tribute eastward to appease the conqueror. But beneath the surface, fear churned. Babylon was not Egypt, distant, ancient, and slow to act. Babylon was near, fierce, and merciless. Nebuchadnezzar's rise also carried cultural and spiritual weight. He envisioned not just a political empire, but a world shaped in Babylon's image. His capital grew into a city of wonder, with walls that seemed to touch the heavens and temples that gleamed with gold. Priests and astrologers claimed the stars confirmed his rule, that the gods themselves had given him dominion. For conquered peoples, the message was clear. To resist Babylon was to resist fate itself. In Jerusalem, prophets wrestled with what his ascendancy meant. Some declared that Babylon was an instrument of God's judgment, the rod in his hand to discipline a rebellious people. Others urged rebellion, clinging to the hope that Egypt might rise again. The nation stood divided, but Nebuchadnezzar's power was not divided. It was growing, unshaken, unstoppable. For the first time, Judah felt the weight of an empire that would not be content with tribute alone. Babylon's rise was not a passing storm. It was the dawn of a new order in which small kingdoms were no longer tolerated as independent players. Nebuchadnezzar intended to rule the world, and Judah's fate would be determined not by its alliances or armies, but by the choices of its kings and the words of its prophets. History had turned, and the stage now belonged to Babylon's ruthless master. The sound of Babylonian boots on Judah's soil sent shivers through the land. Nebuchadnezzar's armies moved like an iron tide, their banners darkening the horizon, their reputation arriving long before the soldiers themselves. The once proud city of Jerusalem, nestled among its hills, had faced enemies before, but never an empire so fierce, so absolute. Egypt's shadow had faded. Now Babylon's lion crouched at the gates. Jehoiakim, Judah's king, had sworn allegiance to Nebuchadnezzar, but loyalty was a garment he wore loosely. He shifted between Egypt and Babylon as the winds of power changed, imagining himself clever, but in truth weaving a noose for his people. Babylon tolerated no wavering. When rebellion stirred in Jerusalem, Nebuchadnezzar answered with steel. His armies encircled the city, cutting off food and hope alike. The people looked from the walls and saw the camps spread like fields of fire, siege towers rising against their stronghold, and they knew pride could not save them. The siege was not long, for hunger breaks resolve quicker than swords. Jerusalem's nobles, who had feasted in palaces while peasants starved, now tasted their own despair. Fear eroded courage, and at last the gates opened. Babylon entered not in haste but with deliberate stride, as though the city already belonged to them. Jehoiakim died before the judgment fell fully, leaving his son Jehoiachin to inherit disaster. The young king reigned only 3 months before surrendering to the inevitable. Nebuchadnezzar did not raise the city, not yet. Instead, he humbled it. From the temple he carried treasures, golden vessels once consecrated to the Lord, now paraded as trophies in Babylon. From the palace and noble houses he selected the best of Judah's youth, sons of princes and scribes, the strong, the intelligent, the promising. They were bound and marched eastward, exiles to serve in a foreign court. Among them were men whose names would echo through history: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, young men torn from their homeland yet destined to bear witness in Babylon itself. The exile of the elite was a wound deeper than walls breached or treasures stolen. Judah's strength, its leadership, its hope for the future, was carried away in chains. Those left behind looked at their emptied homes and felt the city's soul slipping from their grasp. Yet Jehoiachin, humiliated and dethroned, was replaced by his uncle Zedekiah, another puppet king, another fragile reed bending under Babylon's hand. Jerusalem still stood. Its temple still gleamed, but the city had been broken. The people could walk its streets, but they no longer walked in freedom. They prayed in the courts of the temple, but its vessels now adorned pagan halls in Babylon. The first siege had not destroyed Judah completely, but it had stripped away its pride, reminding the nation that the covenant they had abandoned was the only foundation strong enough to stand. Without it, even the walls of Jerusalem could not keep out the storm. They were young, perhaps no older than late boys stepping into manhood. when the gates of Jerusalem opened and Babylon's captains chose them. Sons of noble families, trained in the law and the writings, raised to inherit positions of leadership, they now walked in chains down roads that led not to honor but to exile. Among them were 4 whose names history would remember: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Their feet stumbled on the dusty road, but their hearts carried the memory of the city they loved, its temple now stripped of treasures, its people left trembling behind. The march to Babylon was long, stretching across deserts and rivers, every step carrying them farther from the land of their fathers and closer to the glittering heart of empire. To many of the captives, the journey was a funeral procession, each mile a nail in the coffin of their identity. Yet for Daniel and his companions, something deeper stirred. They had lost home, family, freedom. But they had not lost faith. In the silence of the night, as they lay under foreign stars, they whispered prayers that the God of Israel still heard them, even far from Jerusalem's ruins. Babylon overwhelmed the senses when they finally arrived. Its walls towered beyond imagination. Its gates gleamed with bronze. Its temples rose like mountains dedicated to strange gods. The captives were brought into the courts of Nebuchadnezzar, and there a new life was imposed upon them. Their Hebrew names were stripped away, replaced with Babylonian ones: Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, as if identity itself could be rewritten by decree. They were trained in the language of the Chaldeans, taught the wisdom of Babylon, instructed in astrology, magic, and courtly arts. It was not merely education but assimilation, an attempt to erase Judah from their minds and inscribe Babylon in its place. Yet Daniel and his companions resisted, not with rebellion of sword or voice, but with the quiet defiance of faith. When offered the king's food and wine, rich delicacies sacrificed to idols, they requested vegetables and water instead. Their choice seemed small, almost trivial, but it carried weight beyond the table. It was a declaration that though they lived in Babylon, they did not belong to Babylon. Their loyalty lay not with Nebuchadnezzar, but with the God who had allowed them to be carried away. In time, their faith bore fruit. Their health surpassed that of others who indulged in the king's provisions. Their wisdom, sharpened by study yet anchored in reverence, outshone the magicians and scholars of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar himself would come to marvel at them, though he did not yet know why. Thus, in a foreign land, with names not their own and futures uncertain, the young exiles began a journey that would shape not only their lives, but the faith of generations. Strangers in a city of idols, they carried within them a covenant that no empire could extinguish, a light flickering against Babylon's vast shadow. The years passed under Babylon's yoke, and Jehoiakim chafed beneath it. Tribute flowed eastward: grain, silver, precious things wrested from a weary people, yet in the king's heart burned pride too stubborn to bow forever. He had once sworn loyalty to Nebuchadnezzar, bending like a reed in the wind after Egypt's defeat at Carchemish. But reeds sometimes snap, and Jehoiakim's arrogance made him believe Judah could throw off Babylon's chains. Whispers filled Jerusalem's courts. Egypt, though weakened, still stirred in the south, and envoys brought promises that Pharaoh would rise again to challenge Babylon. Jehoiakim listened with eager ears, convincing himself that Judah stood at the pivot of history, that with clever alliances he might secure freedom. But his counselors trembled, knowing that defiance of Nebuchadnezzar was no game. Babylon's patience was brief, and its armies relentless. Still, the king hardened his will. He stopped sending tribute, breaking faith with the empire whose shadow stretched across the world. The act was bold, but it was folly. Babylon did not overlook insults. Nebuchadnezzar sent raiding bands: Chaldeans, Syrians, Moabites, Ammonites, who swept across Judah like jackals, stripping fields, burning villages, terrifying the people. Jerusalem itself held for a time behind its walls, But the countryside groaned beneath the weight of Jehoiakim's gamble. Farmers fled their land, children starved, caravans ceased to come. Judah had not regained freedom, it had gained chaos. In the midst of this turmoil, Jeremiah's voice rose again. He declared that Jehoiakim's rebellion was not courage but pride, not strategy but sin. The prophet cried that Babylon was the instrument of God's judgment, that resistance apart from repentance would only hasten destruction. He warned the king directly, even at risk of his life, but Jehoiakim would not listen. The same man who had once burned Jeremiah's scroll now burned with contempt for every word the prophet spoke. His heart, harder than cedar, could not bend, even when the evidence of ruin lay all around him. Death came to Jehoiakim before Babylon's full wrath arrived. Whether by illness, intrigue, or the sword, the king who had mocked prophecy and defied empire fell suddenly. He was not mourned with the dignity of his fathers. Jeremiah's words proved true. He was dragged from the city without honor, cast aside like refuse beyond Jerusalem's gates. His reign, marked by arrogance and cruelty, ended in disgrace, leaving his people weaker than before. But Babylon's anger had not cooled with his death. The rebellion he sparked demanded reckoning, and Judah would pay the price. His son Jehoiachin inherited a throne already doomed, a crown heavy with his father's folly. In defying Babylon, Jehoiakim had not restored Judah's independence. He had only lit the fuse of judgment. The city of David stood on borrowed time, and the fire he kindled would soon consume it. The end came quietly, almost without notice, yet its shame echoed louder than a trumpet blast. Jehoiakim, who had strutted in arrogance, who had taxed his people to build palaces while sending their wealth eastward in tribute, who had burned the words of prophecy as though fire could silence God. This king met his death not in triumph, but in dishonor. Babylon's shadow loomed ever closer, and raiding bands already tore at Judah's edges, but Jehoiakim would not live to see the final reckoning. The records are brief, almost evasive, as though the scribes themselves could not bear to detail his fate. Some say he was struck down by Babylonian soldiers, others that illness carried him off. Jeremiah's prophecy spoke with a sharper edge, that he would be buried like a donkey, dragged out and thrown beyond the gates without lamentation. Whatever the precise manner, the truth remains. Jehoiakim died unloved, unmourned, and unhonored. No procession of priests carried him to the tombs of his fathers. No wailing women sang dirges in the streets. His body was cast aside, a grim symbol of how far Judah's crown had fallen. For the people, his death was no comfort. It was a reminder of the ruin his pride had sown. By refusing to remain loyal to Babylon, by chasing Egypt's empty promises, he had invited devastation upon the land. Fields were already stripped bare. Villages smoldered from raids, and fear stalked every corner. His dishonorable end did not erase the consequences of his reign. It only confirmed them. In the palace, his son Jehoiachin inherited the throne at barely 18 years of age. The young king wore his father's crown, but it was a crown already bent. Heavy with the weight of judgment, he walked among walls, trembling with uncertainty, with Babylon's armies assembling once more beyond the horizon. The people watched him with desperate eyes, wondering if youth might bring renewal, or if doom was already sealed. Meanwhile, Jeremiah stood unflinching, declaring that Jehoiakim's fate was a warning written in flesh and dust. The prophet's words had been mocked, his scrolls burned, his life threatened, but now his visions were vindicated. Jehoiakim's dishonorable death testified that no throne, no palace, no foreign alliance could shield a king who despised covenant faithfulness. Thus ended the reign of a man who thought himself clever enough to play empires against each other, who thought himself strong enough to silence the voice of heaven. He was remembered not for victories or reforms, not for wisdom or justice, but for arrogance and shame. The death of Jehoiakim was the death of Judah's illusion that it could rebel against Babylon and survive, that it could spurn God's voice and remain secure. His body lay outside the gates, but his legacy lay heavier still within the city's walls, pressing Judah toward a destiny it could no longer escape. Jehoiakim was scarcely more than a boy when the crown of Judah was set upon his head. 18 years old, he stepped into a throne already crumbling, its foundations cracked by his father's arrogance and Babylon's wrath pressing hard against the walls. His reign began not with celebration but with fear. The people did not cheer as they once had for Josiah. They watched in silence, knowing the armies of Nebuchadnezzar marched nearer with every passing day. The boy king inherited more burden than authority. His father's rebellion had left Judah exposed, its defenses weakened, its people weary from raids and famine. Babylon did not wait long to test him. Within weeks, Nebuchadnezzar's forces appeared like a storm upon the hills, their banners blotting the horizon, their siege engines grinding toward Jerusalem. The city's gates closed, but no one believed they could withstand another onslaught. Jerusalem was a bird in a cage, and Babylon held the snare. Inside the palace, Jehoiakim must have felt the weight of centuries pressing upon him: the throne of David, the temple of Solomon, the promises of covenant and kingdom. Yet what could he do? He was no warrior seasoned by campaigns, no statesman hardened by diplomacy. He was a youth caught in the middle of forces far beyond his reach. Advisors urged him to resist, others to surrender, while the people whispered prayers and curses alike. The siege did not last long. Babylon had no patience for games, and Judah had no strength left for defiance. At last, Jehoiachin opened the gates and stepped out to meet Nebuchadnezzar. He surrendered himself with his mother, his wives, his officials, and his nobles, a procession of captives bowing before the conqueror. It was an act of desperation, but also of dignity. He chose submission rather than slaughter, exile rather than annihilation. Nebuchadnezzar accepted his surrender, but mercy was not in Babylon's heart. Jehoiachin was bound in bronze chains, carried off to a foreign land, another trophy for the empire that claimed the world. Along with him went the treasures of the temple, gold vessels consecrated to the Lord, now destined to gleam in pagan halls. 10,000 captives were taken that day, nobles, artisans, soldiers, leaving behind only the poorest of the people to tend the land. Jerusalem was emptied of its strength, its youth, its promise. So ended a reign of 3 months, too short to leave a mark of governance, long enough only to seal Judah's humiliation. Jehoiachin's name would not be remembered for victories or reforms, but for chains and exile. Yet even in his downfall, threads of hope remained. Prophets would speak of him in Babylon, and his line would survive, a fragile link in the chain of promise leading toward restoration. For now, though, he was a boy king no more, but a captive, carried eastward under the shadow of Babylon's wings, leaving Jerusalem weaker than it had ever been, standing on the edge of collapse. The day the gates opened to Babylon was the day Jerusalem lost its strength. Nebuchadnezzar had come with his armies, and Jehoiachin, scarcely more than a boy, had surrendered himself. But the conqueror's appetite was not satisfied with a king in chains. He reached deeper into the life of Judah and carried away its very heart. From the temple, treasures consecrated for worship were stripped without hesitation. Golden vessels that had once caught the light of incense and sacrifice were hauled onto Babylonian carts, destined for foreign shrines. Each piece was not only wealth but memory, echoes of Solomon's glory now paraded as spoils of conquest. The temple still stood, but its soul seemed diminished, its sanctity mocked by absence. Nebuchadnezzar's decree was merciless. 10,000 captives were chosen, not at random, but with precision. He took the nobility, the officers, the skilled artisans, the warriors, all who might offer resistance or rebuild what Babylon had broken. The city's lifeblood was drained, Its leadership and its craftsmen marched away under guard. Families lined the streets to watch as their sons, brothers, and fathers were bound and led eastward, their footsteps fading into exile. Among the deported were young men of promise, scholars and priests whose wisdom might have guided Judah's future. Daniel and his companions had already been taken in the first wave, but now more joined them: Ezekiel, son of a priest, whose visions in a foreign land would later thunder with both despair and hope. These exiles were not nameless prisoners. They were the marrow of Judah, the very substance of what the nation had been. Those left behind felt the emptiness immediately. The city seemed hollow, its palaces abandoned, its workshops silent. Only the poorest remained, peasants and laborers with little power to resist or to rebuild. Jerusalem still stood, but it stood like a tree stripped of its branches, its fruit carried away. Zedekiah, uncle to Jehoiakim, was placed upon the throne, another puppet in Babylon's hand. But the people could see the truth. Judah's independence was finished. The journey of the exiles was long and bitter. They crossed rivers and deserts, moving farther each day from the hills of Judah, from the Temple Mount, where their prayers had once risen. Tears fell as they remembered Zion, yet in their sorrow, seeds of resilience took root. By the waters of Babylon, psalms would be sung, laments turned into prayers, visions birthed in captivity. The second deportation was more than a transfer of people. It was a dismantling of Judah's soul. Babylon had not yet burned Jerusalem, but it had stripped her bare, ensuring that if rebellion came again, it would rise from weakness, not strength. The land was wounded, the people scattered, the covenant community stretched between homeland and exile. The promise of God seemed dim, but it was not extinguished. Though Nebuchadnezzar had carried away Judah's best, he had not carried away the God who still watched, even from Babylon's plains. The captives sat in the dust of a foreign land, their chains replaced by the invisible weight of despair. Far from Jerusalem's walls, they gathered by the river Chebar in Babylon, a people stripped of home, temple, and hope. Among them was a young priest named Ezekiel, son of Buzi, whose life had once been destined for service in the courts of God. Now he was just another exile, one more voice among the mourners who sang of Zion by the waters of their captivity. Yet it was here, not in Jerusalem, that heaven broke open before him. In the 5th year of Jehoiachin's exile, Ezekiel's eyes were lifted from despair to a vision beyond imagining. The heavens opened, and he saw the glory of God no longer confined to the temple, no longer bound to the land of Judah, but present even in Babylon. Storm clouds churned, flashing fire and brilliant light, and within them came living creatures unlike any he had ever seen. Beings with 4 faces, wings that beat like rushing waters, and wheels within wheels gleaming with eyes. Moving wherever the Spirit led, above them was a throne of sapphire, and upon it a figure radiant with fire and light, surrounded by a rainbow like the one that once sealed God's promise to Noah. Ezekiel fell on his face, overwhelmed, for in that moment he understood what many in exile doubted, that God had not been defeated, nor had his presence been left behind in the ruined courts of Jerusalem. He was the Lord of heaven and earth, and his throne was not chained to a single mountain. Even in Babylon, even by the Chebar, his glory could be seen. The visions did not comfort alone, they commissioned. Ezekiel was called to be a prophet, a watchman for a broken people. A scroll was placed before him, written on both sides with words of lament and woe. He was commanded to eat it, to take into himself the very message he would deliver. To his surprise, though filled with sorrow, the scroll tasted as sweet as honey, for even judgment born from God's mouth carried the flavor of truth. From that day forward, Ezekiel became a voice among the exiles, acting out God's messages in strange, symbolic ways, lying bound on his side for days, shaving his head and beard, building models of Jerusalem under siege. His life itself became prophecy, a living reminder that though the city still stood far away, its destruction was certain unless the people turned back to God. Yet alongside the warnings, he spoke promises. One day the scattered would be gathered. One day hearts of stone would be replaced with hearts of flesh. One day dry bones would rise, clothed in flesh and breath, to form a living nation once more. By the waters of Babylon, Ezekiel saw what few dared believe, that exile was not the end but the crucible where God's glory would be revealed in new ways. His visions by the river Chebar turned despair into prophecy, reminding the people that even in foreign lands, the covenant God still reigned. Zedekiah was not meant to be a king of destiny. He was placed on the throne by Nebuchadnezzar's decree, chosen not for strength or wisdom but for pliability. His true name was Mattaniah, but the Babylonian conqueror renamed him, as if to mark him with ownership. From the beginning, he was not a sovereign but a servant, a reminder to Judah that its crown no longer carried authority. Yet in the hearts of the people, there lingered the desperate hope that perhaps this last son of David might still deliver them. He was 21 when he began to reign, too young to carry the burden of a broken nation, too timid to defy the empire that held Judah in its grasp. In public he tried to appear strong, sitting on the throne with solemn face, listening to counselors, nodding at prophets. But behind the mask lay hesitation. He feared Babylon, feared Egypt, feared his nobles, feared the prophets above all. He feared being seen as weak, yet he never found the courage to choose a path and stand upon it. The voices around him pulled in every direction. Some urged rebellion, promising that Egypt would ride to Judah's aid if only they would cast off Nebuchadnezzar's yoke. Others counseled submission, warning that Babylon's armies were too strong to resist. Jeremiah's voice rose above them all, urging neither Egypt nor Babylon but repentance, calling the king to trust not in alliances but in the covenant with God. Yet Zedekiah wavered. He listened but did not obey. He asked for advice but never followed it. He sought reassurance but shrank from truth. In the palace, nobles mocked his indecision, whispering that he was a reed shaken by every wind. Among the people, murmurs grew louder. Was this truly the heir of David, the shepherd meant to guard his flock? Zedekiah himself seemed to know he was not the man his hour demanded. Fear marked his decisions, and fear shaped his silences. When prophets were beaten, he did not protect them. When nobles demanded blood, he yielded to their pressure. He tried to please everyone and satisfied no one. Nebuchadnezzar expected loyalty, but Zedekiah faltered even there. Caught between fear of Babylon and the illusion of Egyptian rescue, he leaned first one way, then the other, never daring to declare himself openly. His weakness was not the quiet humility of a servant king, but the paralysis of a man unable to act. The crown upon his head weighed heavy, yet he wore it as one who hoped it might vanish before the choice it demanded. Under his reign, Judah did not recover, nor did it resist with honor. It drifted, trapped between the warnings of prophets and the ambitions of empires, its fate hanging on a king without courage. Zedekiah's weakness would prove more destructive than Jehoiakim's pride or Jehoiachin's captivity, for indecision in the face of looming judgment left no room for mercy. He was the last king of Judah, but he was no leader, only a fragile shadow at the edge of a collapsing kingdom. When Nebuchadnezzar placed Zedekiah on Judah's throne, it was not without condition. In the presence of envoys, beneath the weight of Babylon's gaze, Zedekiah swore an oath of loyalty. He pledged in the name of the Lord, the very God of Israel, that he would honor Babylon's dominion. It was more than political submission. It was covenantal. His promise was sealed not only with words but with sacred weight, binding him before heaven as well as men. For a moment, peace seemed possible. Babylon would tolerate Judah's survival so long as tribute flowed and rebellion ceased, but oaths made in fear are rarely kept. In the corridors of his palace, Zedekiah listened to whispers. Ambassadors from Egypt spoke of rising strength, of chariots and armies prepared to confront Babylon's reach. Nobles pressed him with arguments that loyalty was slavery, that David's throne could not bow forever to a pagan king. Pride stirred in the hearts of men who had not yet accepted the depth of Judah's fall. Zedekiah wavered, as always, until fear of appearing weak overcame fear of breaking his word. He turned his ear toward Egypt and his back on Babylon. The prophet Ezekiel, already in exile, thundered against this treachery. In visions he saw it for what it was, not just political betrayal, but spiritual infidelity. To swear by God's name and then to break that oath was to profane the covenant itself. Ezekiel likened Judah to a vine torn from its roots, scorched and withered, destined for fire. Jeremiah too lifted his voice in Jerusalem, pleading with Zedekiah to remain faithful, warning that rebellion would bring ruin. But the king's heart was as water, flowing wherever pressure pushed, and he chose duplicity over obedience. Nebuchadnezzar did not forgive such defiance. Word of Zedekiah's secret dealings with Egypt reached Babylon, as it always did. Spies whispered truth across desert roads, and soon the wrath of the empire was kindled. The king who had once been spared by submission now painted a target upon his own head. Jerusalem braced itself for Babylon's return, though many still deluded themselves with hope that Egypt would ride swiftly to their rescue. The broken covenant was more than a political misstep. It was a fracture of Judah's soul. The nation had always been defined by oaths at Sinai, at Shechem, at Jerusalem itself, covenants binding them to their God. To break faith with Babylon in the very name of the Lord was to dishonor that sacred tradition, to make mockery of promises that were meant to reflect the steadfastness of God himself. It was a sin not only against empire but against heaven. Thus Zedekiah's choice sealed Jerusalem's fate. The oath he broke became the line that divided survival from destruction. Babylon's armies would return, no longer to humble but to annihilate. And all because a weak king swore by God, then betrayed both God and man, shattering what little remained of Judah's integrity. The streets of Jerusalem buzzed with words as much as with footsteps. Rumors carried on the wind, proclamations shouted in the temple courts, messages whispered in the markets, all claiming to speak for God. At the heart of it stood Jeremiah, weary yet unyielding, warning of judgment, urging surrender to Babylon as the only path of survival. His voice was steady, but his message cut deep. The city would fall. The temple would not save them. Exile was certain unless they repented. For many, his words were unbearable, too bitter to accept. And into that bitterness stepped others who called themselves prophets, but whose tongues were guided by the desires of the people rather than the truth of heaven. These false prophets offered what Jerusalem longed to hear. "Peace," they cried. "The Lord will break Babylon's yoke. Within 2 years Jehoiachin and the exiles will return, and the treasures of the temple will be restored." Their words were sweet as honey to a starving people, promising deliverance without repentance, victory without surrender. Crowds flocked to them, applauding their boldness, clinging to their visions. To speak of doom was to be a traitor. To speak of hope, however false, was to be beloved. Jeremiah stood almost alone, mocked and despised. He wore a yoke of wood upon his shoulders, a living sign of Judah's bondage, declaring that to resist Babylon was to resist the will of God. When the prophet Hananiah confronted him in the temple courts, the conflict burst into public spectacle. Hananiah seized Jeremiah's yoke and shattered it before the people, proclaiming that God would break Babylon's power just as he had broken the wooden bonds. Cheers erupted, and the people felt vindicated. For a moment, Jeremiah seemed defeated, silenced by the drama. Yet he returned, carrying not wood but iron. "You have broken a wooden yoke," he declared, "but you will replace it with an iron one. Thus says the Lord, I have put upon the neck of the nations an iron yoke, and they shall serve Nebuchadnezzar." His words fell like stones upon the jubilant crowd. He looked at Hananiah and spoke with sorrowful finality. "The Lord has not sent you. You make this people trust in a lie. Before this year is out, you will die." And so it happened. The conflict between Jeremiah and the false prophets was more than a clash of personalities. It was the struggle between truth and illusion. The false prophets spoke what the nation wanted, crafting dreams out of human hope. Jeremiah spoke what the nation needed, delivering words that cut but could heal if obeyed. The people stood at the crossroads of these voices, and tragically, they chose the lie. They preferred the comfort of falsehood to the sting of truth, sealing their fate even as the armies of Babylon gathered strength once more. In their rejection of Jeremiah, they rejected not the man but the God who had sent him. Jerusalem was a city divided by words. One voice cried judgment, another proclaimed deliverance, and the people stood bewildered between them. Jeremiah, gaunt from years of rejection, entered the temple courts with a wooden yoke strapped across his shoulders. It was a humiliating sight, an elder statesman of prophecy shuffling through the streets burdened like an ox. Yet the message was unmistakable. "Thus says the Lord," he declared, "bring your necks under the yoke of the king of Babylon and live. Resist him, and you will perish." His eyes, filled with sorrow, searched the crowd. Submission was the only path to survival, though it sounded like defeat. Into that moment strode Hananiah, confident, well-spoken, with the bearing of a prophet who had the people's favor. He seized Jeremiah's words and turned them into spectacle. Standing before priests and worshippers, he announced, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, I have broken the yoke of the king of Babylon. Within 2 years I will bring back all the vessels of the temple, and Jehoiachin with them." Hope rippled through the listeners like a fresh wind. Smiles replaced the tension on their faces. Finally, someone was speaking the words their hearts longed for. Hananiah reached out and tore the yoke from Jeremiah's shoulders, breaking it in front of the assembly. Wood splintered on the temple stones, and the crowd erupted with approval. To them, it was a sign, a symbol that Babylon's power was finished, and their suffering soon to end. Hananiah basked in their cheers, while Jeremiah slipped away quietly, humiliated, appearing defeated before the nation he sought to save. But the word of the Lord came again to Jeremiah, and he returned with fire in his voice. "You have broken a yoke of wood," he said, his eyes fixed on Hananiah, "but you shall make in its place a yoke of iron. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I have put upon the neck of all nations the yoke of Nebuchadnezzar, that they may serve him. Those who resist will be destroyed." The joy of the crowd fell silent as his words cut through their fragile optimism. What they celebrated as freedom, Jeremiah named delusion. What they welcomed as prophecy, he denounced as lies. Then came the most sobering pronouncement of all. "Listen, Hananiah, the Lord has not sent you, yet you have made this people trust in a lie. Therefore this year you shall die." The temple that had moments earlier rung with shouts of triumph now echoed with the weight of judgment. Within 2 months, Hananiah was dead, his voice silenced, his promises exposed as false. Yet the people clung to his words even after his passing, preferring the comfort of illusion to the hard truth of iron. Jeremiah's yoke still weighed heavy on their necks, unseen but unbreakable, a sign that God's purposes could not be overturned by wishful thinking. The yoke of iron remained, and Jerusalem's fate was sealed. The captives sat in Babylon, weary and restless, their hearts still turned toward the city they had lost. Many clung to the words of prophets among them who promised swift deliverance, insisting that within a short time Babylon's chains would snap and Jerusalem's gates would open again. Their longing made them easy prey for false hope. But from Jerusalem came a letter carried across deserts and rivers, written by the hand of Jeremiah, the prophet they had once despised. His words reached them not as thunder but as steady rain, shaping their despair into something more enduring. "Build houses and live in them. the letter began. Plant gardens and eat their fruit, take wives and have sons and daughters. Seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray for it, for in its peace you will find your peace. The exiles must have read those words in disbelief. Pray for Babylon. Seek its prosperity? This was not the triumphant promise of imminent return they had hoped to hear. It was counsel for patience, even acceptance. Jeremiah told them what they did not want to believe, that their captivity would not be brief, that 70 years would pass before God gathered them home. Yet within the bitter medicine of endurance came a seed of hope. I know the plans I have for you, the letter declared, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. You will call upon me, and I will hear you. You will seek me and find me, when you seek me with all your heart. These words became a lifeline. Their return would not be swift, but it would be certain. Their God had not abandoned them to Babylon's gods, nor had his covenant been annulled. Their exile was discipline, not destruction. In the refugee camps by the rivers of Babylon, the exiles began to wrestle with this strange command. They planted vineyards in foreign soil. They raised children who would grow to adulthood never knowing Jerusalem's streets. They prayed for Babylon's peace, even as they wept for Zion's loss. The letter reshaped their identity, turning their captivity into a crucible of faith. Meanwhile, false prophets still thundered promises of rebellion and early release, but Jeremiah's letter stood firm against their illusions. His words carried the authority of one who had always spoken truth. However unwelcome, the exiles began to understand that their task was not to scheme for escape but to endure with faith, to hold fast to hope that stretched beyond their lifetimes. In a foreign land, under foreign rule, Jeremiah's letter gave them something Babylon could not chain, the assurance that God's purposes still held. Houses, gardens, children, prayers, these ordinary acts became holy, testifying that exile was not the end but a chapter in the greater story of covenant. Through a prophet's letter, the captives learned that hope is not the denial of hardship but the endurance of it until God's appointed time. The day came when the horizon darkened with dust and the earth trembled beneath countless marching feet. Nebuchadnezzar had returned, no longer content with tribute or half-hearted loyalty. His armies spread across the land like locusts, swallowing villages and trampling fields as they advanced toward the heart of Judah. Jerusalem, perched upon its hills, saw the storm gathering, and fear clutched every soul. The siege had begun. From the walls, watchmen cried warnings as Babylon's banners appeared, black and crimson against the sky. Siege engines rolled into place, towering structures of wood and iron designed to tear through gates and topple walls. The people of the city pressed together, eyes wide with terror, remembering the warnings Jeremiah had spoken. He had begged them to surrender, to bow before Babylon and spare themselves this destruction. Now his words returned to them like a haunting, but still they would not yield. Inside the gates, hunger began its slow work. At first it was manageable, the stockpiled grain and wine sustaining them. But as weeks stretched into months, the supplies dwindled. Bread grew smaller, meals more infrequent. Mothers pressed dry lips against their children's foreheads, whispering comforts they no longer believed. The once bustling markets were empty, the sound of laughter gone from the streets. Everywhere lay the heavy silence of waiting for death, for deliverance, for something to break the agony of suspense. King Zedekiah moved nervously within the palace, torn between his nobles who urged defiance and his own gnawing fear that Jeremiah's prophecies would prove true. Secretly he sent for the prophet, hoping against hope for a word of reprieve. But Jeremiah's message did not change. Those who go out to the Babylonians will live. Those who remain in the city will die by sword, famine, and plague. It was not the answer the king desired, and so he wavered yet again, unable to act decisively even as doom pressed closer. Beyond the walls, Babylon settled into patient confidence. They did not need to storm Jerusalem in haste. They would starve it, choke it, bleed it dry until resistance collapsed under its own weakness. Fires burned in their camps at night, a ring of light surrounding the city, a reminder that no escape was possible. From every gate and tower, the people could see the enemy's presence, constant, unyielding, inevitable. As the months passed, desperation grew. Songs of worship in the temple turned into cries of lament. The priests still offered sacrifices, but their voices were hollow, their eyes filled with dread. Families whispered of breaking out, of fleeing through secret passages, but all knew there was nowhere to run. Jerusalem was a city trapped between heaven's judgment and Babylon's sword. Thus the siege began, not with a clash of armies, but with the slow strangling of hope. Jerusalem's proud walls still stood, but within them the spirit of the people bent lower each day, waiting for the hammer to fall. The walls of Jerusalem stood tall, but they were no longer a symbol of safety. They had become a prison. All around, Babylon's armies camped in perfect formation, their watchfires burning night after night like a crown of judgment around the city. No one entered, no one left. The lifeblood of trade and harvest was cut off, and inside the gates a slow dread settled upon every household. At first, the people whispered that help would come. Egypt had promised aid, and many believed Pharaoh's chariots would soon appear on the horizon. But the horizon remained empty, and the days stretched on. Food supplies began to dwindle. Families rationed their bread, stretching crumbs into meals, pretending to be satisfied while their stomachs growled in betrayal. Markets once alive with noise now stood silent, their stalls empty, their owners gaunt. Even the wealthy, who once dined on meat and wine, now searched desperately for scraps. Hunger sharpened every sound. The creak of an empty jar, the hollow cough of a child, the low moan of a mother unable to nurse her infant all became the soundtrack of a starving city. People grew suspicious of one another, watching their neighbors with accusing eyes, fearful that someone might be hoarding food in secret. Arguments flared into violence, and violence into bloodshed. The city that once prided itself on covenant law now collapsed into lawlessness, survival the only rule that mattered. Fear gnawed at the soul as hunger wasted the body. Each dawn, watchmen scanned the Babylonian lines, hoping to see signs of retreat, but the enemy remained patient, their confidence unbroken. The ring of soldiers was unmovable, as certain as the sunrise. Rumors spread of breaches in the walls, of traitors inside the gates, of conspiracies whispered in the palace. Trust eroded as surely as bread. In the temple, sacrifices still burned, though the priests themselves stumbled with weakness. Their prayers grew desperate, echoing through courts that once rang with song. Jeremiah walked among them, his voice steady, proclaiming that this suffering was not without meaning. "Do not deceive yourselves," he cried, "the city will fall." But the people hated him for his words. Some called him a traitor, others demanded his death. Yet the prophet continued, warning that submission would save lives, while resistance would consume them all. Zedekiah, pale and uncertain, paced the palace halls, torn between his nobles who demanded defiance and his own terror at the prophet's words. He was king in name but not in power, his every decision delayed until too late. He sent messengers in secret to Jeremiah, asking for signs, for prayers, for any hope, but the answers never changed. Babylon would prevail. And so the days turned into months, and Jerusalem became a tomb in waiting. Hunger hollowed its people, fear divided them, and the walls that once promised strength pressed in like stone reminders that escape was impossible. The city groaned under the weight of its own despair, while outside the enemy simply waited, knowing time itself was their greatest weapon. Whispers of rescue floated through the streets of Jerusalem like smoke, thin and fleeting yet desperately inhaled by starving lungs. Egypt had promised aid. Pharaoh's armies, with their gleaming chariots and endless cavalry, were said to be on the move. The nobles clung to this rumor, proclaiming that the south would rise and Babylon would be forced to retreat. Even King Zedekiah allowed himself to believe that perhaps the God of their fathers would stir Egypt to strike down their oppressors. When word reached Nebuchadnezzar's camp that Pharaoh's forces were advancing, the Babylonians withdrew for a time. From the walls of Jerusalem, people erupted in joy. They cheered, certain that deliverance had come. Children laughed for the first time in weeks. And the weak found strength to imagine freedom. The false prophets cried out, "See! Jeremiah was wrong. Babylon flees before us, and the Lord has broken their yoke." In the palace, Zedekiah breathed easier, convinced that perhaps his gamble on rebellion had been wise. But the celebration was short-lived. Pharaoh's army, unprepared for Babylon's might and unwilling to endure a drawn-out campaign, faltered before the clash. Reports trickled back, first whispers, then grim confirmations. Egypt had turned back. Their chariots rolled homeward, leaving Judah abandoned to face its fate alone. The joy that had sparked so briefly died like a candle snuffed in a storm. Jerusalem's people sank into silence, despair heavier now for having been lifted so high. Jeremiah had never shared in their optimism. From the start, he warned that Egypt was a broken reed, a staff that splintered when leaned upon. His words, once mocked, now struck with painful clarity. "Do not deceive yourselves," he had declared, "for Pharaoh shall not save you. Babylon is the rod in the Lord's hand, and against it no ally can stand." Yet even as his truth proved itself, the people hardened their hearts. Instead of repenting, many cursed him, blaming the prophet for their misery, accusing him of weakening morale with his relentless calls to surrender. The nobles raged in secret councils, their pride unwilling to admit their miscalculation. Zedekiah, caught between them and his fear of Babylon, wavered more than ever, his courage dissolving like wax in fire. Each day the famine worsened. Each night the Babylonian watchfires returned to encircle the city, closer now, brighter now, their patience unshaken. The false hope of Egypt became Judah's final humiliation. What little strength remained in the people's hearts drained away with Pharaoh's retreat. They saw now that no nation would come, no ally would ride to their defense. Their fate lay sealed between Babylon's iron and their own rebellion against God. Thus Jerusalem, once proud in its alliances and confident in its cunning, stood alone, surrounded, starving, abandoned. The city learned too late that trust placed in Egypt was trust placed in shadows, and shadows cannot save. The city was crumbling from within long before Babylon breached its walls. Hunger gnawed at every household. Fear whispered in every alley, and suspicion poisoned what little trust remained among the people. In such an hour, Jeremiah's voice rang louder than ever, yet it was a voice few wanted to hear. He walked the streets, proclaiming the same unwelcome message: surrender, and you will live; resist, and you will perish. To ears already filled with false prophets' promises of deliverance, his words were treason. To nobles desperate to preserve their power, his voice was intolerable. It was not enough for them to ignore him. They sought to silence him. Accusations flew. Jeremiah was discouraging the soldiers, weakening the hands of the people, conspiring with Babylon. Fear made lies believable. And soon the prophet of truth was dragged before officials who had long despised his warnings. Zedekiah, weak as ever, wavered. He feared Jeremiah's words might be true, yet he also feared the wrath of his nobles. So he allowed the prophet to be handed over, his silence purchased at the cost of another man's freedom. Jeremiah was beaten and thrown into a cell beneath the house of Jonathan the scribe, a place already turned into a prison. There he sat in darkness, his body aching, his heart heavy, but his resolve unbroken. Later he was moved again, lowered by ropes into a cistern belonging to the king's son. It was no longer filled with water, only with thick mud that clung to his legs and pulled him downward. Alone in the pit, he sank into filth, abandoned to die in silence. Yet even there, God did not forget him. From an unlikely corner came deliverance. Ebed-Melech, an Ethiopian servant in the palace, heard of Jeremiah's plight and approached the king. Bravely he spoke, accusing the princes of evil and pleading for the prophet's life. Zedekiah, too fearful to resist a righteous appeal, relented, and Jeremiah was lifted out of the mire. Though his chains were not removed, he returned to confinement, but he was alive, and his voice still carried. From prison, Jeremiah continued to speak. He sent messages to the king, urging him to surrender while there was still time. He warned of the inevitable destruction of the city, of the futility of trusting in false prophets or broken alliances. His words did not change, though his circumstances worsened. Even behind bars, he remained freer than those who sat in the palace, bound as they were by lies and cowardice. Jeremiah's suffering became a mirror of Judah's condition, truth buried in mud, righteousness beaten and chained, yet still alive, still speaking. The people had silenced the prophet, but they had not silenced God. And though Jeremiah's body ached with the weight of injustice, his spirit stood taller than the walls that surrounded him. He bore the pain of rejection not as defeat but as testimony, a living witness that truth does not vanish simply because men despise it. The palace at Jerusalem had grown into a cage for its king. Zedekiah walked its halls with the weight of fear pressing heavier than his crown. The nobles filled his ears with boasts of defiance, the priests clung to rituals, and the false prophets promised deliverance. Yet deep within, he doubted them all. When the city groaned with hunger, when Babylon's fires burned beyond the walls, it was not their voices that haunted him, but the words of Jeremiah, the man he had allowed to be beaten, chained, and lowered into mud. Unable to silence the unrest in his heart, Zedekiah arranged a secret meeting. Under the cover of night, he summoned guards he trusted and had Jeremiah quietly brought from his confinement. The king cloaked himself in secrecy, fearing his officials would learn of his actions. In a quiet chamber of the palace, lit only by flickering lamps, the two men faced one another. Jeremiah, weary but unbowed, looked at the king with eyes that seemed to see through him. Zedekiah could hardly meet his gaze. "Do not hide anything from me," the king whispered. His voice trembled, not with authority but with desperation. "Is there a word from the Lord?" Jeremiah answered without hesitation, for his message had never changed. "Yes," he said, his tone steady. "You shall be delivered into the hand of the king of Babylon." The silence that followed was suffocating. Zedekiah's shoulders slumped, his fear made visible. He had hoped for some new revelation, some softening of the judgment, but Jeremiah's words were the same as always: inevitable ruin unless he surrendered. "Still," Jeremiah pleaded, "if you will obey the voice of the Lord, if you will surrender to the officials of Babylon, then your life shall be spared, this city will not be burned, and your household will live. But if you do not, then this city shall be given into their hand, and you shall not escape." The king's lips trembled as he confessed what truly bound him. "I am afraid of the Jews who have gone over to the Chaldeans. If I surrender, they will mock me, they will harm me." Fear of shame, fear of men, outweighed fear of God in his heart. Jeremiah assured him that no such fate would befall him if he obeyed, but Zedekiah's weakness was stronger than truth. He longed for deliverance without surrender, safety without obedience. Before the prophet was taken back to his prison, the king leaned closer. "Tell no one of these words," he begged. His concern was not for God's command, but for his reputation. The man who wore a crown remained a prisoner of fear, while the man in chains spoke with freedom. Thus the secret meeting ended, a portrait of Judah's final tragedy. A king who sought truth, yet refused to act on it. and a prophet who suffered for speaking it, both knowing the storm was about to break. The siege dragged on, and the walls that once guarded Jerusalem became the bars of its starvation. Grain bins stood empty, ovens grew cold, and markets that had once bustled with trade now lay silent as tombs. The people wandered the streets with hollow eyes, their cheeks sunken, their lips cracked. Hunger pressed against every household like an unrelenting hand, crushing hope and dignity alike. Mothers, once the strength of their families, now sat in doorways clutching infants who no longer cried, their voices spent. They rocked them gently, as though motion could substitute for milk. Children pawed at the ground, searching for crumbs, licking dust from their fingers in pitiful attempts to fool their bodies into thinking they had eaten. The young grew frail, the old wasted quickly, and everywhere the air hung heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies and despair. Men who once worked their fields with pride stumbled through the streets too weak to stand long. Soldiers on the walls clutched their weapons with trembling hands, their strength gone before the enemy ever struck. Some broke from their posts to scavenge, tearing bark from trees, plucking weeds from between stones, fighting dogs for scraps of refuse. What had once been shameful became survival, and the city's proud heart melted into desperation. The famine did worse than weaken bodies, it twisted the soul. Friends accused each other of hoarding, neighbors turned violent over a crust of bread. Families split apart under the weight of hunger. In hushed tones, stories spread of mothers who could no longer endure the sight of their starving children and turned to unthinkable acts. The sacred bond of parent and child, designed as a shield of love, shattered beneath famine's cruelty. In the temple courts, priests still kindled fires on the altar, but even their offerings grew scarce. They prayed louder, longer, hoping ritual could drown out reality. But the smoke of sacrifice mingled with the stench of decay. Their godly garments hung loose on their bodies. Their once strong voices cracked with weakness. The songs of Zion that had once echoed with joy now broke into sobs, the melody lost in hunger's grip. From his prison, Jeremiah heard the cries and wept. He had warned of this very fate, not to gloat, but because he felt the sorrow long before it arrived. The judgment had descended, and it was not swift but slow, the kind that lingered, the kind that made every day a torment. He knew Babylon's sword was sharp, but famine cut deeper, carving hopelessness into the marrow of the people. Thus the city waited, hollow and trembling, knowing death had already entered long before the walls would fall. Mothers without bread, children without laughter, men without strength. The famine had accomplished what Babylon's armies had only begun. Jerusalem was dying, not with a single blow, but with countless quiet deaths, each one echoing like a lament into the darkening sky. The end came not with trumpet blasts, but with the grinding sound of stone giving way. For months, the Babylonians had battered Jerusalem's walls with their engines, each thud shaking dust from the ceilings of starving homes. The people clung to their hope that the walls, ancient and familiar, would hold as they always had. But hunger had already hollowed the city, and despair had weakened its defenders. When the breach finally came, it was as if the city itself sighed in surrender. In the dead of night, soldiers on the northern ramparts heard a sickening crack. Stones shifted, mortar crumbled, and before they could rally, Babylonian troops surged through the opening like a flood through broken banks. Torches lit the darkness, casting wild shadows on walls that no longer protected but betrayed. The alarm rang out, frantic cries echoing through the narrow streets. Men stumbled from their homes, weak from famine, grabbing whatever weapons they could still lift. Women clutched children and fled deeper into the city, though no corner was truly safe. Inside the palace, chaos reigned. Zedekiah, pale and trembling, listened as messengers gasped out the news. The Babylonians were inside the outer courts. His nobles shouted over one another, some urging immediate surrender, others demanding escape. The king's eyes darted, not toward his people, but toward the narrow passages that led from the city into the darkness of the wilderness beyond. Already he was thinking not of saving Jerusalem, but of saving himself. On the walls, defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew they had nothing left to lose. Their swords clashed against Babylonian spears, their cries mixing with the roar of foreign tongues. But they were too few, too weak, and too broken. For every defender who fell, two more enemies pressed forward, relentless and unyielding. Fire kindled in the breach, the glow spreading like dawn across the city's nightmare. Jeremiah, confined yet unshaken, had foretold this moment. "The city shall be given into the hand of the king of Babylon," he had said. And now the prophecy breathed in smoke and flame. The people, who once mocked him, now saw his words become reality, though it was far too late to heed them. As dawn broke, the breach widened, and the enemy poured in from every side. The proud gates of Jerusalem, once symbols of strength, stood silent as foreign banners waved above them. Fear became panic, and panic dissolved into resignation. Jerusalem was no longer a city resisting, it was prey already in the predator's jaws. The breach in the wall was more than stone crumbling, it was covenant breaking, trust undone, hope shattered. What Babylon's hammers had achieved in a single night was only the visible mark of what sin and rebellion had long been carving in secret. The city's heart had broken long before its walls, and now both lay open, exposed to judgment. When the walls gave way and Babylon's soldiers poured into the city, the cries of Jerusalem rose like smoke. Fire flickered in the streets, steel clashed in the darkness, and the ground shook beneath the march of foreign feet. Amid the chaos, King Zedekiah gathered what courage he had left not to defend his people, but to escape them. In the cover of night, he and his men slipped through a gate near the king's garden, moving silently into the shadows that stretched eastward toward the plains of Jericho. It was a desperate flight, more than a planned escape. Behind him, the city he had sworn to protect burned, the people he had ruled left to their fate. He hurried through the darkness with nobles and guards, stumbling over stones and roots. Every sound of pursuit magnified in his ears. His sandals slapped against the ground, his breath came ragged, but still he pressed on, driven by fear rather than hope. Perhaps he believed that distance could buy him safety, that the Jordan's valley might hide him from Babylon's wrath. The night was eerily still. The fields they crossed bore scars of famine, empty vineyards, trampled wheat, olive groves stripped bare. Once, these lands had been Judah's pride, lush with promise. Now they stood as silent witnesses to a kingdom undone. As Zedekiah ran, he must have remembered Jeremiah's words, the ones he had tried to silence. "You shall not escape," the prophet had said, "but into the hand of the king of Babylon you shall surely be delivered." Yet the king fled as though he could outrun prophecy itself. His companions whispered encouragement, urging speed, glancing behind them at the faint glow of fire on the horizon. The city's destruction lit the sky like a dreadful dawn, casting their shadows long across the wilderness. Each step carried them farther from Jerusalem, but not from judgment. Babylon's net was vast, and its hunters tireless. By the time they reached the plains near Jericho, exhaustion weighed on their limbs. The king's robes, once symbols of authority, dragged in the dust, and his crown felt more like a burden than an honor. There, in the very valley where Israel had once tasted victory when Jericho's walls fell before the Lord, Judah's king tasted defeat. Babylon's soldiers caught them at last, their horses swift, their numbers overwhelming. The flight ended not in triumph but in capture. Zedekiah's escape was always doomed, for no path could lead him away from the judgment he had courted with his oaths and betrayals. As the Babylonians seized him, the night seemed to grow heavier, as though creation itself mourned a king who fled his people, only to fall into the hands of the enemy he feared most. Flight by night had become surrender by dawn, and the last king of Judah stood bound in the valley of Jericho, his destiny sealed. The plain of Jericho, where Israel once celebrated victory in the days of Joshua, now witnessed Judah's final humiliation. Zedekiah, last king of David's line to sit upon the throne in Jerusalem, was dragged from his failed flight, bound like a common prisoner. The Babylonians seized him in the night, their torches casting harsh light on the broken king who had thought he could escape judgment. His nobles, who had fled with him, were taken as well, their pleas silenced by chains and foreign hands. The march back to Nebuchadnezzar's camp was slow and bitter. Zedekiah walked with his head bowed, the crown of Judah now nothing more than a memory. Dust clung to his garments, his face streaked with sweat and despair. Every step drove home the truth Jeremiah had spoken, that resistance would end not in freedom but in captivity. He had feared the mockery of deserters more than the command of God, and now he carried the greater shame of a king captured, powerless before his enemy. In Riblah, the Babylonian stronghold in the north, judgment awaited. Nebuchadnezzar himself sat in authority, the conqueror of nations, the instrument of Judah's downfall. Zedekiah was brought before him, and the king of Babylon looked upon his trembling captive with cold disdain. No words of mercy were offered, no chance for appeal. Zedekiah had broken his oath, and Babylon's vengeance would be merciless. Before his eyes, his sons, the last heirs of his house, were brought forth. Bound and terrified, they stood as living symbols of Judah's fading hope. Zedekiah could do nothing but watch as they were struck down one by one, the royal line extinguished in blood before his face. His cry split the air, a sound of grief so deep it seemed to tear through heaven and earth. That vision, the slaughter of his children, was the final sight his eyes would ever behold. Then the sentence fell in full. Soldiers stepped forward, their hands cruel and unflinching. With iron and violence they took his sight, plunging him into a darkness that would never lift. The king, who had once looked from Jerusalem's palace windows upon the hills of Judah, now saw nothing but endless night. His chains clattered as they bound him, and he was led away stumbling, guided not by choice but by force. Blinded and broken, Zedekiah began his journey to Babylon. No longer king, no longer father, no longer free. He was a prisoner whose very life bore witness to prophecy fulfilled. Jeremiah had warned him of this fate, and now it had come to pass with a precision both terrifying and complete. Thus, the capture of the king became the final symbol of Judah's collapse. A throne left empty, a dynasty shattered, a city in flames. Zedekiah lived on, but his reign was buried in shame, and his sightless eyes became the last chapter of Jerusalem's defiance against the word of the Lord. The moment that generations had feared arrived like a storm no one could stop. Babylonian soldiers, hardened by conquest and fueled by wrath, poured through the shattered city and made their way to the highest point of Jerusalem, the temple of the Lord. For centuries it had stood as the heart of Judah's faith, the place where God's name dwelt, the house that Solomon built with gold and cedar, with prayer and promise. Its white stones had gleamed in the sun, its smoke of sacrifice had risen morning and evening, and its songs had echoed across the hills. Now the enemy surrounded it with firebrands in hand. The priests tried to resist, though faint from hunger and broken by despair. Some clung to the altar, refusing to leave, their cries swallowed by the clash of swords. Others were cut down where they stood, their blood soaking the very pavement where peace offerings had once been poured. Sacred vessels, golden basins, lampstands, censers, and bowls were seized and carried off as plunder. Babylon's soldiers laughed as they stripped the sanctuary bare, treating holy treasures as spoils of war. Then the flames were kindled, dry wood, famine-thinned beams, and cloth hangings caught quickly. Fire climbed the walls, spread along the roof, and roared upward into the heavens. The cedar rafters cracked, the gold overlay melted and ran like streams, and smoke darkened the sky until it seemed as if night had fallen at noon. The holy place, once filled with God's presence, became a furnace of judgment. From the streets below, the people watched with wails that tore from their throats like dying birds. Mothers clutched their children as they pointed to the smoke. Elders fell to the ground and threw dust on their heads. The songs of ascent, once sung with joy as pilgrims climbed toward Zion, now became laments choked with tears. "The house of our God is gone," they cried, unable to believe that the glory they had trusted in for security could be consumed so utterly. Jeremiah, still alive to see it, wept as though his heart had been torn out. He had warned them that trust in the temple's walls, without obedience to God's covenant, was vanity. "Do not say, 'The temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord,'" he had cried. Yet they had clung to stones instead of righteousness, to rituals instead of repentance. Now the stones burned, and the rituals lay in ash. The fire raged until nothing remained but smoldering ruins. The Holy of Holies, once veiled in mystery, lay open to the sky, exposed and desecrated. Jerusalem's pride was gone, her sanctuary reduced to rubble, her God's house silent. It was not Babylon's strength alone that had accomplished this, but the judgment of the Lord, long delayed, now fulfilled. So the temple, once the dwelling place of glory, became a heap of ruins, and with its fall, Judah's heart broke. For they knew the city without its sanctuary was no city at all, only ashes of a covenant they had betrayed. When the temple's flames had died into smoking heaps, the fury of Babylon turned upon the city itself. The soldiers fanned out through every street, not to plunder alone but to erase. Their orders were clear. Jerusalem was to be broken so thoroughly that no power would rise from her again. They began with the walls, those ancient stones that had stood since the days of kings long gone. Towers toppled beneath the blows of siege hammers, their thunder echoing through the valleys. Each crash sent dust rising into the sky, blotting out the sun like a shroud of mourning. Families who once had taken shelter behind those walls now watched them crumble, the symbol of their strength reduced to rubble at their feet. From the walls, the destruction spread inward. Palaces were stripped, then burned. The homes of nobles, once adorned with cedar and ivory, collapsed in showers of sparks. The common houses fared no better. One by one, they were overturned, their stones dragged down, their roofs set aflame. Streets once alive with the cries of merchants, the laughter of children, and the songs of pilgrims filled now with the sound of ruin. The Babylonians worked with pitiless precision, dismantling what famine had already emptied. Whole neighborhoods became heaps of stone. Gardens were trampled, wells filled with debris, gates burned into blackened husks. Where once processions of worshippers had walked up toward Zion, soldiers now marched, kicking aside the remnants of households with the indifference of conquerors. Smoke blanketed the sky. It rose not from a single fire, but from hundreds, the collective burning of a city torn down. Ash settled on everything, on the ruins of homes, on the shoulders of prisoners being led away, on the faces of the few left behind. To breathe was to taste grief, acrid and choking. Through it all, the sound of weeping mingled with the noise of collapsing walls. Mothers mourned, children lost in famine or sword. Fathers stared in silence at the ruins of the houses they had built with their own hands. Old men who remembered the days of Josiah shook their heads, unwilling to believe that the Jerusalem of their youth was gone forever. Jeremiah's tears joined theirs, though his voice had foretold this day. The city had trusted in her strength, in her rituals, in alliances and kings, but not in her God. Now her strength lay in heaps, her pride scattered like dust on the wind. The prophet walked among the ruins with grief too deep for words, yet knowing judgment had run its course. By the time the Babylonians finished, Jerusalem no longer resembled a city. It was a carcass picked clean, a skeleton of walls and gates, a smoldering ruin echoing with cries of loss. The city of David, the joy of the whole earth, had been torn down stone by stone until only memory remained, fragile as the smoke rising into the darkened sky. When the fires had cooled and the ruins settled into silence, the victors turned to their final task. Jerusalem, emptied of pride and stripped of walls, now gave up her people. Babylon had already taken nobles and craftsmen in earlier waves of exile, but this time it was different. This time they gathered what was left survivors gaunt from famine, trembling from fear, broken in body and spirit. The soldiers moved through the shattered streets, seizing men and women alike. Chains clinked as they bound them in groups, iron cutting into skin rubbed raw by hunger. Children clung to their mothers, too weak to resist, their faces streaked with soot and tears. The elderly stumbled as they were prodded forward, leaning on staffs or the shoulders of younger kin, every step a struggle. It was not an army being marched away, but the remains of a people, captives led like cattle across the dust. Those left behind watched with hollow eyes. A few of the poorest were spared, left to till what soil remained. But even they looked on their departing brothers with despair, for though they had been allowed to stay, it was not freedom but survival in a land stripped of joy, a land where the sound of singing had been replaced with the echo of chains. The path from Jerusalem to Babylon was long and cruel. Survivors looked back one final time at the city they had once called home. Smoke still curled upward from the Temple Mount, pillars of memory that would haunt them for generations. The gates where they had once welcomed pilgrims now stood as charred skeletons. The walls that had promised safety were heaps of stone. They turned their faces forward at last, forced by whips and spears, and began the journey into exile. Among them were priests without altars, singers without a temple, craftsmen without tools, families without homes. Each carried not possessions but wounds, some visible, others buried deep within. They walked the same road their ancestors had once traveled in triumph when they left Egypt for a promised land. Now they retraced it in reverse, leaving promise behind for captivity. The irony burned sharper than hunger. Babylon's soldiers sang their own songs as they marched, mocking the defeated. "Sing us one of your songs of Zion," they jeered. But the exiles' throats were dry with sorrow. Their harps hung silent, their voices choked. For how could they sing of the Lord in a land where his house lay in ashes? So the third deportation carried away not just people but the beating heart of Judah's identity. Kingship was gone, temple destroyed, city ruined, and now the people themselves marched into foreign soil. All that remained was memory, carried like fragile embers in the hearts of the captives. The chains rattled as they walked, but beneath the weight of iron stirred the faint hope that somehow, somewhere, God still remembered his covenant, even if they no longer had a city to call their own. When the last chains rattled out of sight and the captives were driven toward Babylon, silence fell over the ruins of Jerusalem. Not everyone had been taken. A remnant remained, not of nobles or warriors, not of priests or scribes, but of the poorest in the land. These were men and women who owned no treasures worth seizing, who possessed no skills valuable to an empire. They were vine dressers, plowmen, potters, and shepherds ordinary people deemed too insignificant to deport. Their survival was not triumph but burden. Babylon had no interest in their lives, only in the land they would tend. Fields still needed care, vines still needed pruning, and flocks still required grazing. The conquerors left them behind as caretakers of a broken inheritance, laborers in a land stripped of its glory. They were free in name, yet their freedom tasted like ashes, for their city was gone, their temple burned, their families either slain or carried away. These poor ones wandered through the streets of rubble, stepping carefully over fallen stones and blackened beams. They passed familiar houses reduced to heaps, sacred places now desecrated. Hunger still stalked them, though the siege was over, for stores had been emptied long before, and the fields outside the city lay trampled by armies. Some scavenged among ruins for grain spilled during plunder, others searched gardens for withered roots. Every meal was a reminder of loss, yet among them stirred resilience. A few began to rebuild crude shelters from the stones that once formed grand houses. They cleared small plots outside the ruined walls, planting seeds with trembling hope that the land might still yield its strength. Grapevines, though twisted and neglected, clung stubbornly to the soil. With careful hands, the vine dressers pruned them back, whispering prayers that fruit would grow again. At night they sat together beneath the stars, their conversations hushed but steady. They spoke of loved ones taken to Babylon, of children lost to famine, of songs they once sang in the temple courts. Tears flowed freely, but so did quiet determination. They were the remnant, and though despised by conquerors, they remained tied to the soil of Judah. Some wondered aloud if God had forgotten them, if the covenant ended with the temple's fire. Others reminded them of the prophet's words, of promises that exile would not last forever. They clung to scraps of memory as if they were treasures, fragments of hope preserved in the hearts of those left behind. So the fate of the poor was not exile but endurance. They became the caretakers of a land in mourning, witnesses to both its ruin and its stubborn life. While kings and nobles languished in Babylon, these humble vine dressers bent their backs to the soil of Judah, waiting for the day when God might once again cause his people to rise from the ashes of their fallen city. After the flames died and the conquerors withdrew, Judah was a land stripped bare of strength. Its kingship had ended in chains, its temple lay in ashes, and its people trudged into exile. Yet Babylon did not leave it entirely desolate. Into the broken land they placed a governor, a man named Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, from a family known for wisdom and loyalty. His appointment brought a fragile hope, a flicker of stability amid ruin. Gedaliah set his seat not in Jerusalem, whose ruins still smoked, but in Mizpah, a smaller town less scarred by war. There he welcomed the remnant left behind, the farmers, the vine dressers, the scattered soldiers who had survived defeat. To them he spoke with calm assurance, urging them to lay down fear, to live quietly, to till the land and serve Babylon with obedience. If they submitted, he promised, they could remain in their homeland. His voice, steady and measured, carried a note of mercy rare in days of conquest, and the people believed him. Those hiding in caves and thickets emerged into the light. Men who had fled beyond the Jordan returned cautiously with their families. They brought tools, seed, and what livestock they still possessed, setting about the hard work of restoring life from ruins. For a brief season, fields were plowed again, vineyards pruned, and oil and wine gathered in abundance. Against all odds, the land began to breathe. Jeremiah, freed by the Babylonians, chose to remain with Gedaliah. The prophet, who had long been rejected by his own people, now stood beside the governor as counselor and witness. His presence lent weight to Gedaliah's rule, for Jeremiah's voice carried the authority of one who had spoken truth before catastrophe. Together they urged the remnant to trust that God's purposes still stretched beyond the exile, that obedience in small things might yet prepare the way for restoration. But even in this fragile peace, shadows lingered. Among the returning men were soldiers hardened by defeat, their hearts restless under foreign rule. They chafed at the call to submit, whispering of rebellion in the corners of fields, watching Gedaliah with suspicion. To them, cooperation with Babylon was betrayal, and the governor's calm seemed weakness. Yet Gedaliah, trusting too much in goodwill, dismissed their murmurs as harmless. For a moment in Judah's shattered story, It seemed a new beginning might take root. Homes were rebuilt, families gathered harvests, and voices of laughter returned to villages long silent. The land, though scarred, still yielded its strength to those who worked it. Hope, fragile as a tender shoot, pushed up from soil once drenched in blood. Gedaliah stood at the center of it, not a king, not a conqueror, but a governor tasked with shepherding survivors. His role was humble, his power limited. But in the ruins of Judah, even such fragile stability felt like a gift. Yet beneath the surface, the same old currents stirred envy, ambition, mistrust, threatening to undo what little had been mended. For in a land broken by judgment, hope itself was a delicate thing, easily crushed. The fragile peace that had begun to take root in Mizpah was short-lived. For a moment it seemed the land might heal, the poor might dwell in safety, and the remnant might find rest. But even in the ruins of Judah, ambition and jealousy stirred. Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, of royal blood, nursed bitter pride. To him, Gedaliah was not a governor but a usurper, a man appointed by Babylon to lord over a broken people. His heart seethed with resentment, and whispers of rebellion fed his rage. Word of a plot reached Gedaliah's ears. Johanan, one of the captains of the scattered soldiers, came to him in Mizpah with urgent warning. Ishmael plans to strike you down. Let me take him by stealth, and no hand will be lifted against you. But Gedaliah, noble in spirit and perhaps too trusting, dismissed the warning. He refused to believe his own countrymen would betray him. To suspect treachery seemed to him a worse sin than to risk his life. Days later, Ishmael arrived with men at his side. They came with feigned courtesy, their hands empty of weapons but their hearts full of deceit. Gedaliah welcomed them warmly, offering food and drink as a host to guests. Around the table they sat, breaking bread together beneath the shadow of betrayal. And there, in the house of fellowship, Ishmael struck. With sudden violence, he and his men rose against their host. Gedaliah fell without defense, slain by the very ones he had trusted. His blood stained the floor, and with it perished the hope of Judah's fragile peace. The slaughter did not end with the governor. Babylonian soldiers stationed nearby were cut down, along with men of Judah who had thrown their lot in with Gedaliah. The plot was ruthless, meant not only to remove a leader but to unravel any order left in the land. Ishmael seized the survivors, binding them, and prepared to carry them away into Ammonite territory where he had allies. Mizpah, once a refuge of calm, became a place of mourning and terror. When word of the treachery spread, Johanan pursued Ishmael with the remnant of his men. They overtook him near Gibeon, and the captives rejoiced at their deliverance, turning to follow Johanan rather than their betrayer. Ishmael, however, escaped with a handful of men, vanishing into Ammon's lands, leaving ruin in his wake. The murder of Gedaliah shattered the last thread of stability. Fear gripped the survivors. They knew Babylon's wrath would return, for the death of its appointed governor would be seen as rebellion. Panic swept through the land as the remnant debated what to do. The quiet hope that had flickered in Mizpah's fields was extinguished in an instant, and once again Judah's soil drank the blood of its own leaders. Thus ended the brief season of peace. Gedaliah, kind and trusting, fell not to foreign enemies but to the hand of his own countrymen. In Mizpah's betrayal, the story of Judah reached another low, proving that even in ruin, pride and envy could still destroy what war had left behind. After Gedaliah's murder, the remnant in Judah was left shaken and terrified. The fragile order he had tried to build collapsed in a single night of treachery. Smoke still lingered over Mizpah's ruins, the ground stained with the blood of their governor. When the survivors gathered in trembling council, fear pressed upon them heavier than famine or chains. They knew Babylon would not overlook such rebellion. Though Gedaliah had trusted them, Nebuchadnezzar would see only disloyalty, only treachery, and his vengeance would be swift. The people turned to Johanan, the soldier who had tried to warn Gedaliah. He now stood as the strongest voice among them. His words, though steady, carried the weight of despair. If we remain here, the king of Babylon will hear what has been done and surely destroy us. There is no safety in this land. We must flee. The thought chilled their hearts, for the land of their fathers was all they had left. Yet the fear of Babylon's wrath drove reason aside. They journeyed southward in haste, gathering children and possessions, driving their flocks before them, hearts pounding with the urgency of survival. Along the way, they sought guidance from Jeremiah. In their desperation they pleaded, "Pray for us, that we may know the way we should go. Whatever the Lord answers, we will do." The prophet, weary but faithful, withdrew to seek God's counsel. Days later he returned with a message as clear as it was unwelcome. "Remain in the land, and you will live. Flee to Egypt, and the sword you fear will follow you there." But fear deafened them. The thought of waiting for Babylon's armies in a land of ruins seemed unbearable. Egypt, ancient and powerful, looked like a refuge, a place where walls and armies still stood, where food might be found, and where Nebuchadnezzar's hand might not reach. They could not trust that staying would bring life, though the prophet said so. They chose instead what their eyes could see, though their hearts trembled at Jeremiah's warning. So the remnant turned toward Egypt. The road south wound through barren land, their footsteps heavy with dread and regret. As they crossed into foreign soil, their exile deepened. Once their fathers had been led out of Egypt in triumph. Now their children returned in desperation. What had once been the house of slavery now became their chosen refuge. Jeremiah, compelled by their decision, went with them, carrying the burden of truth unheeded. His eyes saw further than theirs, and he knew Egypt's promises would prove false, that Babylon's shadow would stretch even there. Yet he walked with them, sharing their fate, bearing witness to a people who could not bring themselves to trust the word of their God. Thus the remnant fled, not as conquerors but as refugees, carrying fear like chains. In Egypt they sought safety, but what they found was the weight of disobedience. Judah's story, already written in ash and exile, now carried another sorrow that those left behind in the land had chosen flight over faith, and Egypt over trust in the Lord. The journey south weighed on Jeremiah like a funeral march. Dust clung to his robes, and sorrow clouded his face, for he knew the remnant was walking not into safety but into judgment. In Mizpah they had sworn before God to heed the words spoken through him, yet when the message came, "Stay in the land, and you will live," they turned their backs and fled toward Egypt. Their oath still echoed in his ears, broken before the ink of memory had dried. At the border of Egypt, before they crossed fully into Pharaoh's shadow, Jeremiah raised his voice one last time. The people gathered reluctantly, wearied from the road but unsettled by the prophet's insistence. Mothers hushed their children, soldiers shifted uneasily, and leaders frowned, wishing the old man would remain silent. But Jeremiah's eyes burned with a fire they could not ignore. "You think Egypt will shelter you," he cried, "but the sword you fear will find you here. Do not trust in Pharaoh's arm, for it is flesh and not spirit. The Lord himself has said, if you dwell in this land, famine will consume you, pestilence will strike you, and Babylon's armies will stretch their hand even into Egypt. You came here to escape death, yet by coming you have chosen it." The crowd murmured, some with anger, others with unease. Johanan and the captains bristled, their faces hardening like stone. "You lie," they shouted. "Baruch, your scribe, has turned your heart against us. You would hand us over to Babylon." Their accusation pierced Jeremiah. Not for its truth, there was none in it, but for what it revealed. Their hearts were closed, their ears deaf, their trust gone. They no longer saw a prophet, they saw only an enemy. Still, Jeremiah would not relent. His voice, though weary, carried the weight of heaven's grief. He reminded them of the sins that had brought them here, the idols that defiled the land, the stubborn pride that had turned kings to ruin. He painted in words the vision of judgment he saw looming. Nebuchadnezzar's banners advancing into Egypt, cities aflame, survivors scattered like chaff. He pleaded not for his own sake, but for theirs, his heart breaking at their blindness. But the people turned away. Some muttered curses, others lifted their faces defiantly, determined to carve their own path even if it led into fire. Mothers clutched their children, eager to press deeper into Egypt's borders, away from the voice that troubled their conscience. Soldiers formed ranks to move the people onward, and Jeremiah was swept along against his will, carried into the very land he had warned against. It was his final plea, unheeded, a cry cast into the wind. The prophet who had once stood in Jerusalem's gates now stood at Egypt's threshold, watching his people repeat the errors of their fathers. His words lingered in the air like smoke from a smothered fire, a last witness to a covenant broken and a destiny embraced that could only end in sorrow. In the shadow of Egypt's temples, the remnant of Judah settled, their fears eased for a moment by the sight of fertile fields and Pharaoh's soldiers marching proudly through the streets. Here, they thought, Nebuchadnezzar's arm could not reach them. They built small homes, tried to plant crops, and convinced themselves they had chosen wisely. Yet beneath the surface of their fragile peace burned the embers of defiance. Jeremiah, still among them, continued to speak the word of the Lord. His voice, cracked by years of sorrow, rose once more with warnings. "Do not turn to the gods of this land," he said, pointing to the towering idols that loomed over Egypt's cities. "Did not the worship of false gods bring Jerusalem to ruin? Will you now repeat the same sins in a foreign land?" His pleas carried the urgency of a man who knew the patience of heaven was wearing thin. But the people would not listen. Men hardened their hearts, women raised their voices in protest, and leaders dismissed him with scorn. A group of women, bold and unafraid, answered the prophet openly. "When we burned incense to the Queen of Heaven," they declared, "we had bread enough and lived in peace. Since we ceased, we have suffered famine and sword. We will do as we vowed, offering cakes to her, pouring out drink offerings, and seeking her blessing." Their words revealed how deep their defiance ran. They saw their calamity not as the fruit of idolatry, but as punishment for neglecting it. Jeremiah's face fell at their reply. His eyes filled with tears, not of surprise, but of grief. He reminded them again of the covenant they had broken, of the prophets who had spoken before him, of the temple that once stood in glory and now lay in ashes because they would not listen. "You think Egypt will shield you, but the Lord will set his throne here in judgment. Nebuchadnezzar will march even into this land, and you who trust in idols will perish in the land you have chosen." His words struck like hammer blows, but their hearts were stone. So the remnant turned fully to rebellion, not only against Babylon but against God himself. They lit fires to foreign gods, poured libations in Egyptian courts, and carried their children to altars not of the Lord's making. Their stubbornness was not ignorance but willful choice, a declaration that they would chart their own course no matter where it led. Thus, Judah's survivors, meant to be the seed of future restoration, became instead a people estranged in heart. The land of Egypt became their refuge and their prison, a place where their defiance would ripen into judgment, and Jeremiah, bound to them by calling though not by choice, bore witness to their resistance, his voice a constant reminder of the God they had refused to obey. In their stubbornness, the remnant revealed the true depth of Judah's wound, not broken walls or burned houses, but hearts hardened beyond repentance. From Egypt's soil, where Judah's remnant hardened their hearts, Jeremiah lifted his eyes beyond their rebellion and spoke words that swept across the world. The fall of Jerusalem had not ended his call. It had widened it. No longer did he cry only against Judah's sins. Now his voice turned to the nations, proclaiming that history itself was not aimless but directed by the hand of God. Babylon, the hammer that had shattered Jerusalem, stood at the center of these prophecies, not as an accident of empire, but as an instrument appointed for a season. He declared that Egypt, proud in its ancient splendor, would stumble. Its idols, towering and gilded, would bow before the march of Babylon's armies. The Nile's wealth, the granaries that had fed kingdoms for centuries, would not protect it from the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. The very land where Judah had sought refuge would tremble under foreign boots, showing that no alliance apart from God could stand. Nor was Egypt alone in his vision. Jeremiah named Philistia, Moab, Ammon, Edom, nations that had mocked Judah's downfall, nations that had seized her fields or rejoiced at her calamity. Each one, he said, would drink from the same cup of wrath. Their fortresses would crumble, their gods would fail them, their people would scatter, for the Lord of hosts measured nations as a man measures cloth and cut them down when they exceeded their bounds. Yet the fiercest words were reserved for Babylon itself. Though raised for judgment, though permitted to trample kingdoms and carry captives away, Babylon was not eternal. Jeremiah spoke of its towers falling, its waters drying up, its wealth plundered, its arrogance humbled. As she has made others drink of the cup, so she too shall drink, the prophet declared. The very empire God used would itself be judged when its appointed task was complete. These words must have startled his hearers. To Judah's remnant, Babylon seemed invincible, a power no army could resist, a shadow stretching across the world. But Jeremiah's vision reminded them and us that no kingdom of men lasts forever. Babylon was mighty, but it was not God. Its rise and fall were written in heaven long before its armies marched. In these prophecies lay a strange comfort. Though nations raged and empires rose like floods, their time was measured. The same God who had brought judgment on Judah also set limits on her oppressors. History was not chaos, but a canvas upon which divine justice moved steadily, even if slowly, to its end. So Jeremiah's voice carried from Egypt to Babylon, from Judah's ruins to distant lands, declaring that the Lord alone ruled the nations. Kingdoms might rise, temples might fall, but destiny belonged not to Pharaoh or Nebuchadnezzar, not to armies or idols, but to the God who appoints times and seasons. Babylon's destiny was written, and in that truth even a shattered people could find a glimmer of hope. The smoke had long drifted from Jerusalem's ruins, but the sorrow lingered like an open wound. Out of that sorrow rose words too heavy for speeches and too raw for sermons. They came instead as poetry, broken lines, weeping verses, cries etched into memory. The Book of Lamentations was not written with ink alone, but with tears, each stanza a testimony to a city brought low. How lonely sits the city, once full of people. The opening line captured the desolation. Streets once thronged with pilgrims on feast days now echoed with silence. Marketplaces where voices bargained and laughter rose stood empty, save for scavengers and wild animals. The Temple Mount, once resplendent with sacrifices and songs, lay charred and abandoned. The city that had been the joy of nations now sat as a widow, veiled in grief, her children gone into exile. The poet's voice was not distant but deeply personal. He did not describe ruins as an outsider. He entered into them, bearing their weight. He named the hunger that had driven mothers to unthinkable acts, the shame of kings who had fled, the mockery of nations who had watched Zion fall. His laments turned grief into a chorus, so that every broken life found voice within the verses. It was as though the city itself spoke, crying out from its ashes. Yet woven into the poetry of despair was also the thread of confession. The poet did not blame Babylon alone, or curse the cruelty of men. He saw deeper. We have transgressed and rebelled, he admitted. The fall was not mere misfortune but judgment, the consequence of long disregarded warnings. The city's grief was mingled with guilt, sorrow with shame. Tears fell not only for what was lost, but for why it had been lost. Still, in the middle of lament, a strange light flickered. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases, his mercies never come to an end. These words rose like a fragile flame in the darkness, not erasing the sorrow but piercing it. Even as walls lay in rubble and children wept in captivity, hope whispered that God's mercy remained, hidden yet alive. The poet taught grief not to deny despair, but to cling to faith within it. Lamentations became more than a record of pain. It was a sacred space for mourning. It gave Israel permission to weep, to name suffering without rushing past it. It showed that faith could cry out, question, even accuse, and still remain faith. For in lament, sorrow is carried into the presence of God rather than away from it. Thus the city wept in poetry, its grief immortalized in lines recited long after the ashes cooled. The tears of Jerusalem became scripture, a witness that even in desolation, the voice of God's people would not be silenced. Lament itself became an act of faith, declaring that pain had meaning, and that grief, poured out honestly, might yet prepare the way for healing. By the rivers of Babylon, the captives sat, their heads bowed low, their harps hanging mute upon the willows. The waters that once promised refreshment mirrored only their tears. Here, far from Zion, the exiles found no song, yet it was in this silence that one of Israel's most haunting psalms was born. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. The words carried the ache of displacement, the ache of a people torn from their home, their temple, and their identity. Their captors mocked them, demanding songs of joy. "Sing us one of the songs of Zion," they jeered, as though holy music could be performed as entertainment for foreign ears. But the exiles felt the weight of their loss too heavily. "How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land?" they cried. The melodies once lifted in praise amid the temple courts now stuck in their throats, for to sing them in Babylon seemed like betrayal, as though joy could be faked while grief still pressed on their hearts. Yet, in the very refusal to sing, a deeper song formed a song of memory and fierce devotion. "If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. Let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you." These words were an oath sworn in tears, a vow that exile would not erase Zion from their hearts. Though the temple lay in ruins, though Babylon's rivers separated them from Judah's hills, Jerusalem remained their highest joy. It lived within them as promise, as identity, as a home no conqueror could take. The psalm's voice also carried the raw cry for justice. The exiles remembered the cruelty of Edom, who rejoiced when Jerusalem fell, urging the Babylonians to tear her down to the foundations. They remembered the bloodshed, the shame, the laughter of enemies at Zion's collapse. From this pain rose a plea for God to repay the nations in kind, a desperate call that the scales of justice might one day be balanced. The bitterness of those lines revealed not pettiness but the depth of wounds left unhealed. Psalm 137 became the anthem of the displaced, a song of sorrow and remembrance. It bore the tension between grief and faith, between rage and hope. It refused to let suffering dissolve into silence, instead shaping lament into words that endured. By Babylon's rivers, where homesick hearts wept, a vow was sealed. They might be slaves in a foreign land, but their spirits would never surrender Jerusalem. Generations later, when the exiles' descendants returned, they carried this psalm like a flame through the long night. It reminded them that even in the darkest foreign soil, identity could be preserved through memory, devotion, and the stubborn refusal to forget the place where God's name had dwelled. In their grief, they found a song, after all, not of entertainment, but of endurance, a melody woven of longing, justice, and unbroken hope. The ruins of Jerusalem cried out a question too heavy to ignore. Why had God allowed his own city to fall? To the nations, it looked like proof that Babylon's gods were stronger, that the Lord of Israel had abandoned his people. To the exiles, it felt like the end of the covenant itself, as though every promise had been broken when the temple burned and the ark was lost. Yet out of the ashes came a deeper interpretation, one woven through the voices of prophets and poets who had long warned of this day. Jeremiah, who had walked the streets of the doomed city, he spoke with clarity that cut through confusion. This was not defeat of God, but fulfillment of his word. The destruction was not a failure of divine power, but its very exercise. A judgment on covenant breakers who had shed innocent blood, defiled the temple with idols, and hardened their hearts against countless warnings. Babylon had not conquered by its own might. It was the rod of the Lord's discipline, a tool raised for a season to execute justice. Ezekiel, far away by the river Chebar, saw visions that made sense of exile. He beheld the glory of the Lord departing from the temple, lifting from the holy place, and rising above the city before it fell. The message was unmistakable. God was not tied to stone walls or golden altars. His presence could not be contained, and when his people profaned his name, he withdrew. Yet even in this withdrawal was hope, for Ezekiel also saw a future temple, a renewed covenant, a time when the Spirit would dwell not in a building but in the hearts of a restored people. The writers of Lamentations gave voice to grief, but even in lament they recognized the justice of it all. The Lord is righteous, for we have rebelled against his word, they confessed. Their poetry revealed that suffering did not come from divine neglect but from divine faithfulness. The God who kept his covenant not only to bless but also to discipline. Pain became proof that his promises were true, even when those promises cut deep. In exile, reflection ripened into repentance. Teachers and elders began to see the fall as a cleansing fire, a necessary breaking so that pride, idolatry, and injustice could be stripped away. The land had not been lost forever, but allowed to rest while its people learned anew what it meant to belong to God. The covenant was not destroyed, but refined. Its heart shifted from rituals performed in stone courts to obedience written on living hearts. Thus, the fall of Jerusalem, tragic and humiliating, became a turning point. It proved that God's holiness could not be mocked, that his justice would not be delayed, and that his covenant love was fierce enough to tear down in order to rebuild. Out of destruction came interpretation. The city fell not because God was weak, but because he was faithful, and in that faithfulness lay the seed of hope for a new beginning. Amid the rubble of Jerusalem and the bitterness of exile, words of hope began to stir like shoots breaking through scorched earth. The prophets, who had so often thundered judgment, now spoke of promises that reached beyond destruction. Jeremiah, once imprisoned for declaring the city's doom, lifted his voice to announce something astonishing. The days were coming when God would make a new covenant with his people, not like the one written on stone tablets and kept in a temple now turned to ash, but one inscribed directly upon their hearts. This vision seemed impossible to captives who had lost everything. They sat by Babylon's rivers, mourning the end of all they had known. Yet Jeremiah's words carried a promise that exile was not the final chapter. God had not cast off his people forever. He would gather them again, not only restoring land and city, but reshaping the very core of their relationship with him. They would no longer stumble under laws they could not keep or depend upon kings who led them astray. Instead, every man and woman would know the Lord personally, his law etched within them, his spirit dwelling among them. Ezekiel, in his visions, saw dry bones scattered across a valley, symbols of a nation cut down and lifeless. At God's command, those bones rattled and rose, sinews and flesh covering them, breath entering their lungs until they stood as a vast army. The vision was more than spectacle. It was promise. Israel, though dead in despair, would live again. God himself would breathe into them, restore them, and plant them back in their land. Even the covenant curses, so painfully fulfilled in the fall of Jerusalem, became in prophetic vision the soil for new blessings. Where the old covenant had been broken, the new would be unbreakable, not because of human strength but because of divine mercy. "I will forgive their iniquity," Jeremiah declared, "and remember their sin no more." Such words, whispered in a world where the smoke of judgment still lingered, shone like stars piercing the darkest night. Hope did not erase sorrow, but it transformed it. The exile was not meaningless. It was a crucible. Out of loss would come renewal, out of discipline a deeper intimacy with God. The temple could burn, kings could fall, nations could scatter. Yet the promises of God stood firm. He who had torn down would also build up, and he who had uprooted would plant again. So the people clung to these promises as to a lifeline. Around Babylonian fires, in Egyptian refuges, in villages left desolate in Judah, they recited the words of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, tasting in them a future beyond ruin. The new covenant was not yet visible, but its promise was enough to keep hope alive. In the midst of ashes, they learned that God's faithfulness endures even through judgment, and that ruin itself can become the doorway to redemption. The exiles gathered by the Chebar Canal carried despair like a second skin. Their temple was gone, their city burned, their king blinded and led away in chains. In their hearts the question beat like a drum: could a nation so utterly broken ever rise again? Into this silence of hopelessness came Ezekiel's vision, as startling as it was impossible. He was carried by the Spirit into a valley, and the ground beneath his feet was littered with bones. They were not freshly fallen, but dry and brittle, bleached by sun and time, scattered as though forgotten by the world. The prophet walked among them, step after step, hearing only the crunch of death beneath his sandals. It was a graveyard without graves, a picture of finality. Then came the voice of God. "Son of man, can these bones live?" Ezekiel, trembling at the sight, answered only, "Lord, you know." The command came, "Prophesy over these bones." So he spoke, and at once the valley stirred. A sound like a great rattling filled the air as bones clattered together, finding their long-lost companions. Skeletons rose from the dust, sinews stretched across them, flesh covered them, and skin sealed their forms. Still, they lay silent, lifeless, until the word came again. "Prophesy to the breath," Ezekiel called out, and the wind of heaven rushed in from the four corners of the earth, filling lungs that had been empty for ages. The dead stood upright, not as a handful but as an immense army, living and strong. The meaning was plain. "These bones are the whole house of Israel," the Lord declared. "They say, 'Our bones are dried up, our hope is lost, we are cut off.' But I will open your graves, O my people. I will bring you back into your land. I will put my spirit within you, and you shall live." What the exiles thought impossible, God showed in vivid image. The end was not the end. From the ashes of judgment, life would return. This vision was more than a promise of physical return. It spoke to the inner death that exile had wrought. The people's faith had grown brittle, their spirits parched by despair. Ezekiel's vision revealed that God could breathe life where none remained, could restore not only a land but a people's heart. The valley of bones was the mirror of their souls, and the Spirit's breath was the pledge that they were not abandoned. In foreign soil, by Babylon's rivers, this vision became a seed of hope. The exiles whispered it to one another. If God could raise bones from dust, he could raise a nation from captivity. The grave of exile would not hold them forever. The same God who judged would also restore, and his breath would bring life again. In the heart of Babylon, where golden idols towered and kings demanded worship, A young exile named Daniel lived out the strange calling of faithfulness in a foreign land. Torn from Jerusalem as a youth, trained in the language and learning of Chaldeans, clothed in garments of empire, he seemed every inch a servant of Babylon. Yet beneath the robes beat a heart that still belonged to the God of Israel. He walked palace halls with the wisdom of Babylon in his mouth, but the prayers of Zion on his lips. From the very beginning, Daniel set himself apart. When offered rich foods and wine from the king's table, he and his companions quietly refused, choosing instead the simplicity of vegetables and water. To others it seemed foolish, but to Daniel it was faith, a way to keep covenant even in exile. God honored their resolve. Their faces shone with health, their minds sharpened beyond their peers, so that Nebuchadnezzar himself marveled at their wisdom. Dreams troubled that great king, visions none of his astrologers could explain. But Daniel, turning always to the God of heaven, revealed their meaning with humility. Kingdoms would rise and fall, but only God's kingdom would endure forever. The statues of gold and silver, the fires of the furnace, the edicts that sought to bend men's worship, all of them proved powerless against the faith of those who served the Lord. Daniel and his friends stood firm. Whether facing lions' jaws or flames 7 times heated, and in their courage the exiles saw that God had not abandoned them. What began as survival became testimony. Babylon's rulers, from Nebuchadnezzar to Darius, were forced to acknowledge the God of Israel through Daniel's faith. His vision stretched beyond empire and exile, unveiling the sweep of history, the rise of nations yet unborn, and the ultimate triumph of a kingdom not made by human hands. In the heart of the world's greatest city, where every symbol of Judah's downfall was magnified, God planted a witness that his sovereignty still ruled. For the captives by the rivers, Daniel became a living parable. His story showed that faithfulness did not depend on temple walls or Jerusalem's streets. A man could live in Babylon, serve in its courts, and still belong wholly to God. His courage reminded them that exile was not the end, but a place where new forms of devotion could flourish, where integrity could shine even against overwhelming odds. So Daniel's life echoed like a psalm in a strange land, a reminder that though their harps hung silent, their God still reigned. In him, the faithful remnant saw that even in the shadow of idols, prayer could rise, visions could come, and covenant loyalty could endure. Babylon might hold their bodies, but not their souls, for the God of heaven had shown himself mighty in the life of one who refused to bow. The smoke of Jerusalem's ruin lingered in memory long after the fires had cooled. Stones lay scattered, walls broken, and the temple, the very heart of the nation, was a heap of ash. Yet even as exiles wept by Babylon's rivers and the remnant struggled in a land stripped bare, seeds of restoration were quietly being sown. The God who had allowed judgment had not abandoned his people. Hidden beneath the sorrow was the promise of return. Through the prophets came whispers of hope. Jeremiah, though despised in his day, had spoken of 70 years of captivity, not endless despair. His words carried the assurance that exile was discipline, not destruction, a season with an appointed end. Ezekiel's visions of dry bones rising and a new temple shining with glory hinted that the story was not finished. Even Daniel, in Babylon's court, read the signs of times and prayed with certainty that God's mercy would outlast Babylon's power. Meanwhile, the exile itself became a furnace refining faith. Cut off from the temple, the people learned to seek God in prayer, in fasting, in the reading of his word. Synagogues sprang up, humble gatherings where Torah was remembered and recited. What seemed loss at first became preservation, a way for faith to endure when sacrifices could no longer be offered. In foreign soil, identity deepened, carried not in kings or palaces, but in covenant and memory. Babylon, for all its grandeur, proved no eternal throne. Empires shifted like sand, and the mighty city itself fell to Persia. Under Cyrus, A new word was spoken, astonishing in its simplicity and power. The exiles were free to return. They could go back to their land, rebuild their temple, and plant their lives once more on Judah's soil. What Babylon had burned, God now stirred to restore through an unexpected deliverer, a pagan king whom Scripture would call his servant. The first steps of return were small, fragile, hesitant. Those who journeyed back found more rubble than streets, more weeds than fields. Yet on that desolate hill where the temple had once stood, an altar was raised again. Stones were stacked, not to match Solomon's glory, but to mark a beginning. Songs rose where silence had reigned, and offerings smoked heavenward, fragile yet fragrant with faith. From ruins to return, the story of Judah became one of divine mercy woven through human weakness. The fall had been devastating, but it was not final. The God who had torn down also planted anew, proving that his covenant was not broken but renewed through fire and exile. The people had been scattered, but not forsaken. Disciplined, but not destroyed. Out of judgment came restoration, and from ashes hope. The memory of ruin would never be forgotten, but neither would the promise that God's mercies are new every morning. The return was only a beginning, but it was enough to show that even after the darkest night, dawn can break upon the people of God.